Hey guys, welcome to part 3 of What If Naruto was trained by Anko. If you enjoy the video then like, share and subscribe, and also comment your thoughts as it inspires me to make more such videos, and also check out my other playlist, hope you would like them too. So let's get started. Chapter 7. New Team. The Uchiha clan. The largest, most powerful clan in Konoha. They possessed the feared bloodline limit, the Sharingan, which while unable to compete with the Byakugan in reading ability, could copy any move and offer a sort of telepathy. They had even formed and still made up the bulk of the Konoha military police force. To be Uchiha was to be second to no one. Yet Uchiha Sasuke had failed in this regard. It was one thing to be outshone by the likes of Itachi, who was so insanely brilliant and powerful that not even their father could control the ninja. It was an entirely another thing to be outshone by Naruto. Uzumaki Naruto, the dead last loser from the academy. For several years Sasuke had been first and had taken a mild delight in rubbing it in the boy's face. Yet not too long ago, having allowed his pride and desire to show off to a pink-haired teammate get the better of him, Sasuke had fought with Naruto, and though the advantage had been his for most of the fight, Naruto had actually won. Somehow, that blonde moron had found a way to get inside Sasuke's defenses and strike him. Therefore, no matter how well he did on his mission to Wave Country, no matter how much Sakura assured him that he was great and strong, Sasuke could feel his chin burning from the weak blow. He had tried to analyze every moment of that fight, and could see nothing. All he knew was that Naruto had moved without any body movement. As impossible as that sounded, it was true, and Uchiha Sasuke was tormented by that fact. What good were his eyes if he couldn't see his enemy? That was the single question repeating in his mind, making him the single most depressing person ever. Even now, finished with training for the morning, Sasuke was brooding. He couldn't help it, he wanted to know what style Naruto had used and how it could even exist. I still say those Yakuza weren't much. Kiba suddenly said from his stretched out position in the field, his white dog resting comfortably on his chest. I beat up like 5 or 6 without even breaking a sweat. I don't see why we have to keep training. Sasuke snorted, closing his eyes. Was there any point in bragging about that when you were not even among the top of the genin group? Aha, but those demon brothers were insane. Sakura suddenly added, her tone fanciful. Sasuke-kun handled them perfectly. Sasuke opened his eyes to stare at her. If you have time to compliment me, you should work on your denbutsu. He saw the surprise on her face and allowed a brief smile to show. She blushed faintly, and he could tell she would continue practicing well after they were gone. She had said it several times to him, that she would do anything to make him happy. After the first few times he had told her that he could never like a weakling like her. And she had started putting a great deal of effort into her training. His thoughts, however, were derailed as a loud and disturbingly familiar voice drifted up from the forest. "W. But do we really have to practice taijutsu? We just did that this morning." Sasuke was on his feet in a heartbeat, his every muscle taut. What was that loser doing out here? Seconds later, a battered-looking Naruto, who was missing his jacket and his sensei, came striding into view. The woman looked as if she was near a breaking point, and Naruto looked as if he was ready to start begging. "Oi, it's Naruto," Kiba said, sitting up, which displaced a Kamar. "I can't wait to rub his nose in our completed mission." "You are a real idiot, aren't you?" Sasuke muttered, watching as Kiba climbed to his feet and started waving and shouting. It was obvious that Naruto had just gotten back from a mission, possibly a C-ranked mission as well. Sasuke would have felt no surprise at that. After all, according to Shikamaru, the blonde had been gone for almost the same length of time as they had. "Oi, Naruto!" Kiba shouted, cupping his hands around his mouth. Naruto turned and spotted the grey-jacketed boy, waving back enthusiastically. Kiba took a deep breath and then continued his shouting. "Hey! We completed a C-rank mission. We kicked ass and took names." Sasuke saw the annoyance on Anko's face as Naruto grinned while cupping his own hands. "Bah! That's nothing. I just completed a B-rank mission to Grass Country." Sasuke narrowed his eyes, staring at the blonde in mute anger, aware that Kiba and Sakura were both shocked into silence. They would of course assume he was lying, but Sasuke knew better. He wasn't sure why or how, but Sasuke knew that Naruto had indeed outperformed him. Again. He just never stops lying. Kiba grumbled finally, watching as Anko grabbed the back of his shirt and yanked him off his feet as they continued on their way to the gates. Sakura nodded in agreement, frowning ever so slightly. Yeah, as if that Naruto could really do a B-ranked mission. He wasn't lying, Sasuke said, his tone expressionless. Turning his gaze on Sakura and the surprised Kiba, he continued. His jacket was missing and both of their packs were nearly empty. Okay, so he had a mission, Kiba said dismissively as he laid back on the ground near a disgruntled Akama. Still wasn't a B-ranked one. If Sasuke-kun said he did, then he did. Sakura suddenly said defensively, glaring at the boy, and Sasuke turned away. Balling his fists tightly, he heard his knuckles pop, then not saying another word, he moved away from the two arguing genin to begin training once more. He would not be second to that loser. For the last time, Naruto, we are going to practice Taijutsu today. Anko grated out, glaring at the boy who was almost pouting. But why? Naruto demanded, stopping suddenly. First, Anko hissed, stopping as well, a kunai slipping quietly into the palm of her hand. Because I said we were. Turning, she fired it off, forcing the blonde to jump aside to avoid getting run through. Second off, because if that ninja had been any damn good, he would have killed you 3 seconds into that fight. No way. I kicked his ass, he couldn't even slow me down. Naruto shouted defiantly, crossing his arms. Anko, however, solved his moment of defiance with a carefully aimed kunai, then when he dodged that she was in front of him, the blade of another pressed tightly against his throat. Seeing the panic in his eyes, she bore down on him with all of her impressive intimidation. You will practice Taijutsu, you will not complain, and you will go to that hospital for the examination. Naruto to protest, only to fall silent as the blade pressed even firmer against his throat. Do not make me kill you, Anko hissed, eyes narrowing. I'm running out of places to hide the bodies. When Naruto nodded, Anko smiled faintly, while slipping the kunai into a pocket. She was actually sort of pleased with the boy's growth so far. He wasn't heartless, probably never would be, but he was strong and he could take a life. Most importantly, he was learning how to hide his darker feelings. He had almost perfected that smile and act of foolery to the point that Anko, if she didn't have her connection to him, would never be able to tell if felt anything or not. He was becoming the perfect teammate in Anko's opinion, or at least her perfect teammate. Still, if she didn't get some time away from Naruto, she was going to either kill him or slaughter the first person with blonde hair that she saw. Thus the reason why she had told him about the examination, though he still didn't really understand why he had to go. Seeing the dubious look on his face, Anko sighed, trying the only thing that ever seemed to work with Naruto, when he was being stubborn. Listen, I know you don't want to have that exam, but it's the best thing for all involved. Every time you go on a mission, you could pick up a disease. Seeing his eyes widening, Anko grinned sadistically. Of course you could be like that one genin I knew. Came back with a strange skin rash that quickly dissolved his entire body. Well, I guess if it's important. Naruto said, eyes wide, obviously warming to the idea. Anko nodded, mentally rubbing her hand together. Yep. Now remember, we has Taijutsu training too. So you had better get your ass in gear and head to the hospital. Met me at around noon in the usual spot. Right. Naruto said, before he was up and running away from her. Stretching, Anko stood, chuckling. Life was good. A bounce found its way into her step. She was feeling as if she had finally got the hang of this sensor crap, and Naruto was nothing like most other children. Which meant the Hokage would get to keep his balls. For now. Laughing at that image, she entered the tower, bypassing several disturbed-looking office workers, and made a beeline for the mission hall. Her mood considerably better now that Naruto was no longer around to pester her. She started to consider how best to tease Oka. Sadly, she was denied such fun when she entered the mission hall and found Nara Shikaki behind the mission desk. Damn. Well, there went most of her fun still. When life gives you lemons. Much to Anko's surprise, the man, like Oka, didn't even look up at her entrance. It wasn't until she had reached the table he was seated at and leaned a hip against it that he moved. Shiaki let his eyes give her body a quick glance, then forced down the appreciative smile that had appeared on his face. Where you been? Anko tapped a finger against her cheek, then smiled sweetly. Finding out what sort of moves my new teammate has. Seeing his surprise at her double entendre, she leaned forward slightly. You want to show me your moves? Aye. Shikaki coughed, easing back slightly. I don't think. That is. See. Hair. Anko interrupted him, popping her neck before reaching into her jacket to produce a tightly bound scroll. Mission report. It was completed successfully. HH. The Nara man said, relaxing as he started shuffling through papers. Well, that's good. The Hokage told me that he wanted to see you immediately after you got back. Ho, what's that old bastard want? Anko muttered before shrugging. Well, if that's it, I'm gonna go get some real sake before I see that old coot and kick Naruto's ass. Ring 8. Shikaki said, letting his eyes drift below her neckline. Seconds later he had diverted his attention, due to the fact that a kunai had appeared from nowhere in Anko's hand and was now spinning around her index finger. Laughing at how easy he was to intimidate, she turned away, strutting back toward the doors as they opened to allow a haggard-looking kurenai to enter. Boys sure are energetic, aren't they? Anko purred papas a bit too suggestively, seeing the horror on the other woman's face. Wow minus. Kurenai whirled around, only two, has the door slammed in her face. Chuckling to herself, Anko strode down the hallway, debating about which bar to visit before seeing to Naruto's training, then paused remembering that the Hokage wanted to see her. That was unusual to say the least, maybe he wanted to hear her report firsthand. Now, it wasn't that important. Of course he could has another mission for them already, now that was a possibility. Putting off her sake for the moment, Anko altered directions slightly and made her way to the spiraling staircase that would lead to the Hokage office. Reaching the landing quickly, Anko hesitated, glancing around, wondering at the lack of security. Normally she could feel various unboo, even if it was faint, but now there was nothing. Shrugging it off, she walked along the hallway and then, without knocking, opened the door to the Hokage's office. She was one of the few people in the world, the others being the Sannin, and Kakashi minus, that could get away with such an act. Idly she wondered if Naruto would ever get to this point of casualness with the most powerful ninja in the village. Seeing the old man looking at her intently, Anko gave a two-fingered salute before crossing the room to flop into her usual seat. So what's up? Got a new mission for me and my brat, or you just want a cheap thrill from seeing me? That was when Anko noted the displeasure on the older man's face. Displeasure was bad. Had she finally crossed some invisible line? Actually, I had wanted to hear a brief rundown on your mission, Sandame said after a moment before picking his pipe up to light it. However, I now think for your sake that we should discuss the main reason for wanting to see you. Ho. Anko managed articulately. As I said a little over a month ago, Naruto's graduation was somewhat atypical, and he was not accounted for when the genin teams were originally put together. The Sandame paused as if thinking and then nodded, blowing a smoke ring. Incorporating him into one of the existing teams then would be difficult. However, something has happened that is beneficial for all involved. What are you getting at? Anko asked, slowly sitting forward, a vague thought taking shape in her mind. A current genin has recently injured himself and been forced into retirement. This has created a shortage for his team, which, as you know, the genin is a three-man cell. Naruto, as the only available genin that is not already in a three-man cell, is therefore being transferred minus. What? Anko shouted, standing up as if the seat had bit her. Naruto is my student. For the duration until the completion of the Chunin exams. The Sandame continued calmly. All this requires is that you allow him to work with another team. He does need to learn how to work with others after all, especially if he wishes to be Hokage someday. I refuse. Anko said harshly. I'm not letting some half-rate bleeding heart take Naruto and totally screw up everything I've accomplished with him. Anko-chan, it's not like you won't be training him or taking him out on the occasional mission. He just needs to experience working in a full team. Naruto is the only person in this whole damn village that doesn't care that I had a deranged sociopath as a sensei. Anko said evenly, eyes growing cold. I trained him. He's my student. My solider. You can't minus. I thought he was a Konoha ninja. Sandame said, cutting her off sharply. Anko, I assure you that this is for the best. That bitch Kurenai finally got you to bend over and take it, didn't she? Anko said scathingly, eyes narrowing. It's all her damn idea. Naruto is mine. I'm not going to let some prick that you and that stuck-up pain in the ass bitch selected just take him away. Sandame's face suddenly turned serious, his eyes hardening. Suddenly he was filled with an air of total authority as he stood, intimidating Anko into taking a half-step back. Mitarashi Anko. That is enough. I am Hokage of this village. I am the one who decides who teaches whom. I am the one that decides who goes into battle and who does not. Breathing heavily, he sat back down, his voice still commanding. Naruto is now a member of Team 9. He will meet his new team tonight at 8 in Training Area 9. He will be fit for duty. Do I make myself clear? As glass. Anko muttered, turning to storm out of the office. Anko. He needs to be on a 3-man team for the tune-in exams. I would prefer he had some experience with them before then. No need to explain. Anko said coldly, turning as she opened the door. I understand. You can't risk the heartless murdering bitch creating a heartless murdering bastard. Then before the Hokage could say another word, she stalked out of the office, slamming the door behind her. Naruto stared absently at the floor between his feet, wondering about the lime green medical gown. He glanced once more at a tray of medical instruments hidden beneath a white cloth, both wanting to know and not wanting to know what they were. He was not even sure why he was still here. Oh well, at least he had gotten this far. The last time he was in the hospital, Naruto had not even been allowed past the emergency room doors. Eyeing the clock with mounting impatience, Naruto finally decided that he was not going to wait around for some damn doctor and hopped off the table. Grumbling, the blonde walked to the cabinet where the nurse had put his clothes, only to discover that it was locked. Damn it! Naruto shouted, grabbing the handle and yanking hard, trying desperately to open the doors. Hello, Azumaki-san, I'm... A new voice started, only to trail off as the door to the room clicked open. What are you doing? Hair. Naruto managed, turning slowly to stare at the slightly grayed-haired man dressed in a white doctor's coat. I'm trying to get my clothes. Well, please have a seat. The doctor said, and Naruto quickly retreated to the medical examination bed, trying to put the man at ease. He was not stupid. He could remember the last doctor's visit, from when he was 5. Now then, Azumaki-san, I am Dr. Kiyoshi. The man said, offering a brief smile. Oh. Hi. Kiyoshi blinked, staring at him closely. Strange, why would the Hokage ask me? Ho. Waving a hand, the doctor brushed him off, moving over to the counter, working a minor summoning before with a puff, a folder appeared. Frowning, he picked up the thin object, checked the name on the cover, then flipped it open, reading the single page contained within. Azumaki-san. When was the last time you received a checkup? Oh. I've never had one. Naruto answered, his tone betraying his confusion. Well, we do has one entry for you. According to your file, you came in several years ago complaining about a scraped cheek to the on-duty Dr. Kibira-san. Kiyoshi turned, glancing at Naruto as if seeking confirmation. Like hell. Naruto said forcefully, indignation in his voice. I was pelted with rocks and that bastard doctor chased me out. He what? Kiyoshi responded, eyes darkening. Chased me out. Naruto shouted. I see. Kiyoshi muttered. Making a note in the file. Too bad for him, he's up for promotion this week. Done. He pulled a rolling chair up and sat down. Now then, I guess I'll do a complete physical examination. What exactly is a complete physical? Oh. Kiyoshi said, looking up from his scribbling in the folder. Just normal stuff like checking your reflexes, tolerance to certain allergens and medicines, susceptibility to healing jutsus, blood tests, and well. A dray. What? A dray, a digital rectal exam. It's to check your prostate. Kiyoshi smiled reassuringly. I assure you it's quite normal for ninja returning from missions, so nothing to get upset over. Rectal. Naruto muttered, eyes wide, and then suddenly he darted off the table and grabbed the locked door, trying to yank it open. Behind him, he heard the snap of a plastic glove and froze. I suppose if you're going to act like that, I better do the dray first. Neat. INO sighed, rubbing her temples, staring blankly at the empty classroom. 3 days of waiting around was getting boring. Every morning her team INO- would gather in this classroom, and await their Jonin sensei Harate to hear how their wounded comrade Yamap Anzai was doing. It was funny, but until Anzai had been wounded, INO couldn't stand the boy. She had even commented to a friend once that it would have been no skin off her nose if the boy died. Anzai was fine as long as you were not around him for more than a few minutes. If you actually knew him, he could make Naruto, that foul-mouthed, ill-mannered runt who had too much energy and never shut up from the academy, look like Sasuke. So it was really strange that ever since Anazi had gotten hurt it wasn't even clear how minus she had felt guilty for ever thinking that. Kami. Shino had been the one to suggest waiting in the classroom. He was bothered by how cold the hospital was and the way INO kept fussing. Shino was not big on fussing or on being powerless to help a teammate, which INO had learned over the course of the time they spent together on the same team. Didn't mean she liked him. Shino was an okay guy, but he let bugs live inside him. That was definitely not a pleasant thought. Still, he was good. He actually handled most of the missions that involved planning. If only he wouldn't talk to the bugs. Ugh. Why couldn't she have Sasuke on her team? Sasuke was handsome, brave, heralded as a genius. Plus he belonged to a famous clan. Oh, you just know that whoever could win his heart would have undying loyalty from him. Shaking her head and adjusting her ponytail out of habit, INO promised that for the chance to win the boy's heart, she would have gladly even taken on Anasai as her other teammate. Why did that big forehead, pink-haired bimbo Sakura get her Sasuke? How was that even fair? Sighing, INO forced herself to stop thinking about the two, which was a monumental feat, and accepted her fate for now. She'd still win Sasuke, it would just take a tad more effort. Lost in her daydream, she completely failed to register the sound of the door opening or the coughing of her sensor until he was inside, and Shino greeted the man. Harate sensor. What Anze's condition? Don't worry, he's fine. The sword-toting Jonin said, before covering his mouth to cough. Eyes drooping a bit more, he stared at the two before sighing. I should probably tell you what happened exactly. Yeah, that'd be nice. INO deadpan staring at the chronically sick man. We've been waiting 3 days for that. I was sparring Anzai and he tried a jutsu he wasn't ready for. Harate said, coughing once more. He's also decided to quit as a ninja. He says that he was never warned of the danger in being a ninja. That's bullshit. INO shouted, her guilt suddenly gone. That moron hurts himself, and then claims he was never warned about being a ninja. Kami, he went through the academy with us. Even that Naruto understood how dangerous it was. Good point. Harate conceded, eving back slightly. It is his decision. Shino said calmly, looking in INO's direction before he shifted his gaze to Harate. What of our team? We will be 1 man short. Harate coughed, then nodded. I've taken care of that. It won't be permanent, but I've arranged for a fill-in for Anzai. He'll meet us later today at our usual training area. INO blinked, then scowled in thought, who was their new teammate. Well, it was obviously male and a temporary situation. It couldn't be. She prayed that she was right though. Oh sweet Kami, let it be him. She'd show that pink-haired bimbo now. That's it. Meet up at the regular training area at 8. Coughing, Harate finished. INO crossed her fingers, prayed that it would be Sasuke, and wondered what to wear. Hey Konohamaru, what did you think of Urka Sensei etch lesson today? Uden asked, sniffling as he was prone to do. Konohamaru shrugged, kicking idly at a pebble. He really didn't know why he was hanging out with Uden or Mauve, other than the fact that they had needed him to stop some of the other students from making fun of them. They were sort of friends, but indirectly they were using him because of his grandfather. Like everyone else. But they were nice enough, and they made it a point of never mentioning his famous relative. I thought it was wonderful. Mauve piped up, glancing at Konohamaru in that way. It took all of his willpower to keep from running away. The girl was downright scary when she looked at him like that. As if he was a piece of steak and she was just dying to eat him or something. Well, I thought so too. Uden said quickly, making it painfully obvious to Konohamaru that Uden liked Mauve. The girl turned a smile on her face, talking with the other boy, distracted for the moment. Konohamaru took this as his chance to fall back and allow them to pull away from him. It wasn't so much because of the conversation, it wasn't because he was tired of them, but ever since Ebisu had stopped tutoring him something about professional courtesy, Konohamaru had begun to get antsy. He wanted real training, not what that guy at the academy was teaching. That was why he let them continue on without him, because he had realized what had been bothering him and how much he had no way of getting it. There wasn't a single ninja in this whole village that would train him now, he was sure of that. Even a sumo wouldn't train him. Glancing at a scroll shop, he eyed a display that proclaimed a scroll to self-teach kinbutsu. What if he knew one of those? He could beat his grandfather then for sure. But then he noticed the age and rank notice, meaning he had no chance of getting that scroll. Ugh, I hate being a kid, don't you, Mauve? Konohamaru paused, realizing that he was alone, and looked around. Oh yeah, he had let them go on without him. Damn. Oh well, this meant at the very least he could go bug someone to show him something. Maybe he would look for that Naruto his grandfather had told Asuma about once. Well, it would give him something to do at least, but other than knowing the boy wore orange and was only a few years older than him, Konohamaru didn't hold out much hope of actually finding the blonde. Hey! Naruto, get back here! Someone suddenly shouted from a stall down the street, and Konohamaru turned just as an orange figure darted out of the shop. Hair! Put it on my tab, old man. Acting on instinct, Konohamaru darted in the boy's way, forcing the blonde to skid to a halt and stare at him in confusion and annoyance. Oi! Are you blind? Of course not. Konohamaru shouted back, lifting his head to stare at the blonde for a moment. I want you to train me. Huh? Naruto blinked, scratching the back of his head. Train me? Konohamaru said, daring the boy to refuse. HN. Naruto blinked as if he wasn't sure what to make of him. I'm not going to train you. Train minus, Konohamaru started to shout before he was cut off by the blonde's fist smashing into the top of his head. Stupid brat. Train me or I'll tell minus. Konohamaru stopped, then glared up at the boy, rubbing at his head. If he used his grandfather's name, then he would be using his family and would get no reciprocity, but he would still get trained. Tell who you runt. My grandpa the Hokiv. Konohamaru muttered, looking as disgusted as he felt for having to use that ploy. So you're related to that old Billy Goat man? Naruto said, blinking before turning to walk away. Well, I'm still not training you. Konohamaru blinked, taken back by that boy's refusal to train him and the way he had referred to his grandpa. Nobody had ever done that or talked that way about the Hokage before. Suddenly Konohamaru's childish desire to try and prank this boy into training him became a fanatic's desire. I'm not just going to stop asking. I ain't gonna train ya, Naruto called back over his shoulder without even slowing down. Konohamaru growled and then followed after him, shouting to the boy to train him. Yamanaka INO was bored out of her mind. Her parents, in their infinite wisdom that she still couldn't understand minus, had come to the brilliant decision that since INO had nothing to do for the day, that she could watch the flower shop for the morning. INO was not a morning person, and such a suggestion was tantamount to telling her she would be forced onto a team with Naruto. No way in bloody hell that could have happened. She actually couldn't decide which would be worse, having Naruto as a teammate, or having to put up with Sakura the big four-headed bimbo minus rubbing the fact that her team was already doing C-ranked missions. Ooh. INO wanted to too. She wasn't sure what she wanted to do, but violence was indeed involved in some way. All it would probably take is for Sakura to stroll into INO's flower shop and say, oh, still no real missions, INO pig. That's okay. And INO would snap. Grumbling, she propped her chin on her hand and glared daggers at the door to her shop. She knew one thing for sure: by the time they had the next team training session, she was going to has a lot of pent-up hostility. Not that she could really do much against Shino or Harate. Shino was always indifferent about that. Not that had he said he much to her, Shino, while he did care for his team, was not a talkative person. Unless bugs were involved. Then you couldn't shut him up. On average, however, he hardly said more than a sentence, and rarely used words over 2 syllables. At least he had fashion sense, that grey high-collared jacket worked for him. Harate was just badass. INO had seen him use his sword once. She had never seen a blade move that fast. It was almost enough to make her want to learn Kenbutsu. A thingl later, she was snapped out of her thoughts and found herself staring at a pink-haired, green-eyed girl. Sakura looked entirely too smug for INO's tastes. Still, INO had a job to do. Welcome to Yamanaka Flowers. Hey, INO pig. INO felt her eyes start twitching. Hello, big forehead girl. Sakura's own eyes started twitching, and INO took a vindictive pleasure in that. Are you here to admit that Sasuke-kun is mine? As if. Sakura sniffed, crossing her arms. My mum has an order. INO bit off her response and quickly shuffled through the small stack of orders before selecting the order in question. INO studied it for a moment, then nodded, moving around the counter to start gathering the required flowers. Sakura just nodded, thankfully being as quiet as possible while INO worked. That was one thing that INO gave her former friend, Sakura, credit for. Sakura appreciated the fine art of flower arrangement almost as much as INO did. Sadly, the instant INO finished and the business was taken care of, they were both back to verbally fighting. It only ended when Sakura left, tossing one last insult over her shoulder, and INO was left enraged enough to throw a vase at the door. Damned pink-haired Sasuke stealer. Staring at the shattered pieces of the jars, INO seethed, then grabbed a broom, knuckles white as she stomped around the counter. Could this day get any worse? Okay, let's see what you got, Naruto said, holding a thumb up as if signaling good luck. Konohamaru held a fist in front him, his voice louder than even Naruto's. You'll see what I has right now. That shouted, he went charging across the clearing at full steam, plotting to nail the boy with a right cross, and then his world exploded into a universe of pain. Seconds later he landed on the ground heavily, something foul filling his mouth. Sitting up he spat, staring in wide-eyed horror at the red glob that escaped him. He was bleeding. Panicking, he stared at the boy, who was looking equally surprised, which infuriated Konohamaru, who jumped to his feet. What the hell are you doing? Trying to kill me? Naruto blinked, then shrugged. Don't charge in head-on, or I will kill you. Konohamaru blinked, then raised his hands in an X shape. Are you crazy? I'm not going to do that. Oi, but I agreed to train you. So you should do what I say, right? Can't you teach me a jutsu or something? Konohamaru asked, glaring at the blonde intently. Oh. No. Naruto shrugged, scratching the side of his head. You know, now that I think about, why don't you just ask your grandpa for some help? Who cares about my grandfather? Konohamaru shouted angrily, bristling. I don't need him or his help. Well, I think you do. Naruto shrugged. Something inside Konohamaru demanded that he make Naruto see him. Ebisi, Oka, Asuma, they had all taught him mostly because of his grandfather minus, and all of those lessons came into play at this moment. What shuriken he had was suddenly whistling through the air, thrown only as a child could, and Konohamaru was traveling in their wake, preparing to attack with a jumping cross. That was when he found a new teacher. The blonde dodged the first shuriken Konohamaru had thrown, bent at the waist to avoid two more, then came around and drove a punch into his stomach. Gasping in pain and the lack of air, Konohamaru hung there for a split second, and then his arm was wrenched around and he smashed into the ground. Seconds later his wrist felt as if it was about to snap, and a cold metal blade came into contact with his throat. Konohamaru, through his pain and tears, felt his bladder let go as he stared into those eyes, convinced of how close death was. Naruto remained stationary for several more minutes, and then slowly his face paled and he stood shakily backing away, as if he couldn't believe what he had just done. Konohamaru remained where he was, at tears of pain and urine his trademark, but he was alive. Naruto started to say before pausing, the horrified look on his face shifting to a mask of confidence. You'll has to get hurt and you'll has to bleed, you can't rely on your grandpa or anyone else. That's the only way to get stronger. Always remember that, Konohamaru. And never give up. That said, the blonde turned and took off, getting as far from him as possible in the minutes it took Konohamaru to recover. It was several more before he could get to his feet, and when he did, Konohamaru just stood there. He stared after the blonde, taking his words to heart while trying to replay how exactly that last encounter had happened. Then, heedless of his wet clothes or the pain he was still feeling, he tried to imitate what his new sensei had done to him as best he could. Naruto darted and weaved through the crowd, eyeing the sun, defected but hiding it. Seeing the street getting even more crowded, he cursed and, using his training, performed a rebounding leap onto the rooftops to continue his run before dropping back to the ground. Seconds later he came bursting out of the bushes into the familiar training grounds, skidding to a halt as he spotted Anko on top one of the posts. Her gaze shifted from the trees to him, and then she looked away, her voice odd. You're actually here on time. Oh. That's a good thing, right? Naruto said slowly, moving closer, his instincts on edge. At any moment he fully expected a surprise attack. Seeing none in the immediate future, the blonde slowly sat on the ground staring up at his sensei, who continued to ignore him for the moment. Several minutes of silence passed, and then Anko spoke. How do you feel now about that ninja you killed? Suddenly her eyes snapped to his face, gaze unreadable. I'm not sure. Sometimes it's like, I still can't accept it. Most of the time I don't think about him, and when I do I realize minus Naruto stopped looking down, the realization that he had while fighting the kid from earlier flashing through his mind. I realize I'll always have to kill. That it's a part of who I am now. Even if I don't want to. Anko nodded, then took a sip from a bottle of sake that Naruto hadn't noticed until now. The woman in question, however, acted as if nothing was out of the ordinary. How close was it? Ho. Naruto blinked, feeling uneasy. Could she know just how close he had come to killing that kid earlier? No, that was impossible. Anko shook her head, waving a hand as if dismissing her question while taking another gulp of sake. Forget it. Are you drunk? Naruto asked, squinting up at her. No, Anko paused. Not yet, at least. She gave him a pleasant smile, which sent a chill down his back. By the way, I've got an order for you from the Hokage. Order. HN. You need to be in one piece, the team training at 8 in training area 9. Anko explained, her voice almost growling. A team's lost a member and you've been assigned as a part-time fill-in. What? I thought you were minus. Naruto started to protest until Anko cut him off. Save your breath. I've already argued with the Hokage. From what I gather, you'll have 2 teams and we'll just rotate you. Anko explained, scowling before looking at her sake bottle and muttering, I still say this is that bitch Kurena's doing. Naruto. Am I a bad person? Anko suddenly asked, her voice sounding odd once more. Naruto sat there a moment, scowling, then shook his head and crossed his arms. Well, you mean you like trying to kill me? Nodding, he stared at her defiantly. I don't think you're bad. Just psycho. Anko suddenly stared at him intently. I want to explain something to you before. I've done things that people in this village hate me for. Things they should hate me for. Like what? Naruto asked, blinking in confusion. He honestly couldn't think of anything she could have done to make everyone hate her. Then again, as Naruto knew from experience, this village really didn't need much to hate someone. I killed my own teammates once. Anko suddenly admitted. What? Naruto shouted, jumping to his feet to stare at her in horror. She had. That's minus. Do you know what it's like to love someone so intensely that you'd do anything for them? To care so deeply that you'd follow any order? Anko asked coldly, cutting him off. No. Naruto felt the chill on his spine increasing. I'm not surprised. Anko said, her eyes flickering away from him for a moment before looking back at him. Naruto, I did a lot of things, Thoro-sensei, things that I shouldn't. I have. I knew they were wrong. I knew that he was doing things he shouldn't. But I didn't tell for a long time. I let him do things that I shouldn't have. Naruto just stared in silence, wondering what she was talking about why he suddenly felt betrayed, why he wanted to shout and rave. Still, however, he didn't feel the hate that the villagers had to feel for her, but then that was probably due to him being unable to make others suffer. Still, he didn't understand. The villagers don't care that he lied to me, that he made me love him, that he fooled a gullible teenager. Anko said, darkly staring at him. Only that I helped him, and that I'm still here, and that he's not. They hate me because they don't understand what it's like to be an outcast, how lonely that is, and how willing you are to let yourself be fooled by the one that acknowledges you. Naruto stared at her, his thoughts suddenly racing a million different directions. At first he wanted to rant and rave and shout that it didn't matter her reasons, she should have known better than believe that. Yet he was reminded of Mizuki and of how willing he had been to believe the man, of how lonely being an outcast was, of how much he wanted to prove himself to anyone that would acknowledge him. That's why that bitch Kurena got the Hokage to take you away. She thinks I'm going to become like my teacher. Anko said hatefully. I'm nothing like him. Nothing. Anko. The dark-haired Jonin, however, fixed him with an angry glare. What? Do you hate me too, just like all those other narrow-minded bigots? I'm not surprised. How the hell could you understand minus? Are you sorry about what you did? Naruto said, cutting her triad off. Anko froze, her gaze intense, and Naruto seriously began to wonder if she might not have decided to kill him. Then he saw the way her face changed, how her eyes that had shown anger and hate changed into something else. Why do you think I'm still here? Anko finally said, her voice edged with remorse. I try to show them. I try to make it up. They won't forgive me, nobody, not even the Hokiv. He just sees me as an experienced ninja and Konoha needs as many as it can get. Why won't they forgive me? Anko asked, her voice almost growing too soft to be heard. Why? I'm sorry. I don't understand why they won't forgive me. Naruto stared at her intently, watching as her head lowered and her voice grew softer. Obviously she was drunker than she had led him to believe, but that didn't change what she was saying. He could feel his anger building toward the villagers. It was an anger born from them hurting someone that he had grown close to. Anko was the first person, after Oka, to really acknowledge him, the first person that seemed to care about him, and the villagers were treating her like trash. I forgive you. Naruto suddenly said, his voice firm. I mean, if you're sorry then that's it. That's how it's supposed to work, right? You make a mistake and you apologize, you try to make it up, at least that's what Oka-sensei always told me. Anko looked up at him, her face blank, then a small smile appeared. Maybe you're not useless after all, runt. Hey! Naruto shouted, only to frown as a thought occurred to him. Oi, who's my new team? I don't know. Anko muttered, waving a hand dismissively. Don't really care, but until then you better practice those kunai tricks I showed you on the way back from Kusa. Right. Naruto said, smiling faintly. Anko shook her head and hopped off the post, wobbling slightly when she landed. Meanwhile, I'm going to go torment a Cyclops. Anko grinned, waving a familiar book. Have fun. Anko chirped as she walked past him and then stopped, turning to glance at him. Damn it, why couldn't you be a few years older? I could use a nice guy like you. Then laughing at herself, Anko disappeared in a puff of smoke. Naruto stared after her blankly, then shook his head, turning toward the post while slipping a kunai out of his holster. Anko really didn't make any sense. When she was drunk she was already using him. What did a few years matter? INO would have smiled, really she would have, after all being freed from working in a family flower shop was grounds for smiling. Sadly in INO's opinion she had been freed only to suffer an even worse fate, meeting her new teammate. She was still praying it was Sasuke. Actually INO would gladly take anyone as her teammate as long as it wasn't her ex-best friend. Why did Anzai have to even quit? He should have learned from his damn mistake and not been so reckless next time. Not that INO could really say anything. Compared to almost everyone else in her year, she was completely pathetic. Her one skill was the family jutsu. It was not designed for combat, nor was INO very good at using it. She had tried to pick up a jutsu from Harate, but the man said he didn't know any outside of the basics that didn't involve a sword. She toyed once more with the concept of taking up kenjutsu, it would give her something. But she'd has a small amount of surprise walking around with a sword strapped to her back. Maybe if the sword was smaller and less obvious. INO mused for a moment, then put those thoughts to the side for another time. She was running late and broke into a light jog, working her way through the streets of the market before taking a left and entering the forest. Taking the almost hidden path, she bent saplings out of her way, slipping through the bushes, cursing Harate for picking this type of location for training. Didn't that man understand this ruined clothes? INO was going to has to buy a new outfit after this, not that she would really complain. Stepping into the clearing, she found the 3 training logs, with Harate casually standing beside one, with Shino seated at the base of another, finger extended and speaking with a bud. Good. She wasn't late. That would have been embarrassing to say the least. Imagine what Sasuke would have thought had he been here and she'd been late. That was when a sound reminiscent of a stampede reverberated through the still forest air, followed shortly by INO tumbling to the ground, tangled in an orange, blue and blonde blur, who was yelling that he wasn't late, that he had been training and all sorts of other crazy things. Attempting to untangle herself from the boy, she registered that it was Naruto, and unfortunately, while he was shouting in INO's ear, he was attempting to get back to his feet, complicating her own efforts. To make matters even worse, at some point in their attempt to get up and separate, his hands ended up places they had no business being, as did her own. Convinced that both had been his plan, she suddenly bolted upright, shrugging him off, and began beating him black and blue while shouting "pervert" at the top of her lungs. When she finally finished, INO dusted her hands off, huffed and turned on her heel. Right. Harate said, fatigue obvious in his voice. I guess I don't have to introduce our newest teammate. INO froze, her eyes widening in disbelief at what Harate had just said, registered with her. Had she committed some horrible sin in a past life? Or desecrated a shrine without knowing? Please let this all be one horrible sick joke. There was a moment of silence. And then several things happened at once. INO and Naruto pointed at each other, and started shouting at the same time. Why do I have this annoying bitch on my team? Why do I have this annoying prick on my team? This was followed by both freezing and turning to glare at each other. Who are you calling annoying? They shouted at the same time once more. This led to both allowing an eye to twitch before they lunged at each other. 20 seconds later, a deeply disturbed Harate and Shino was looking at two grumbling and battered blonde ninja. INO glared at Harate and then at Naruto and then back at him. How could things have degenerated into this? Of course. Sakura has a hand in this or something. Hell, until this moment she had thought Naruto was a villager now. INO stopped scowling. Now that she thought about it, Naruto being here didn't make any sense. Turning, she started to ask her sensei about that. Only two has the Jonin answer her unasked question. Azumaki-san has been apprenticing to Anko-senpai, and has already completed a B-rank mission. What? INO managed glancing at the boy once more in disbelief. Naruto in response stuck his tongue out at her and then started laughing. Naruto had done a B-rank mission. Naruto. That Naruto. Impossible. Not even Sasuke-kun had done one of those yet. INO, if you can stop giving our new teammate that look, I'll explain our upcoming mission. Harate said, then completely unaffected by her scowl, started explaining the mission he had been hinting at for the last week or so. The mission is B-ranked. At the customer village's request minus. Why would they wish to increase the rating? Shino asked, and INO was pleased to see the idiot in orange bolt in surprise. Not that she could blame Naruto. Shino rarely spoke and he was so quiet in the first place, it was hard to remember he was even there. As I said, the village initiated that its rank be raised. Most likely the headman and elders are just anxious to has it completed. So really, this will be a C-rank mission with B-ranked pay. Harate shrugged before coughing into his hand. As for the mission itself, it is very straightforward and rather simple for a C-ranked mission. Oi! What exactly is the mission? More enemy ninja, or do we have to kill monsters? Naruto asked, looking excited. Actually it's much more mundane. Harate replied blandly. There has been a rash of unexplained kidnappings in a remote area of Fire Country, so our mission is to first find and stop those responsible and then second rescue all of those kidnapped that we can. Shouldn't we let someone else handle it then? INO asked, not liking the sound of this. She glanced at Shino, seeking some sort of support, but the boy merely raised an eyebrow. Harate, on the other hand, just coughed and continued as if none of them had said anything. We leave tomorrow morning at 10. We are traveling to the village of Nigariki, which is geographically isolated by ravines and mountains. But why yes? INO almost demanded. I mean, don't you think this is a bit more than we can handle? Harate blinked, looking at her. You shouldn't has any problems. These are most likely only bandits. Besides, Kurenai-san's team has already completed a mission of this level. It was you, INO-san, that demanded a C-ranked mission, so please kindly keep that in mind. But INO stammered, uneasy with how he shot that at her. She had really only demanded it because of Sakura. INO had no delusions that she could really perform such a mission. Now, however, it seemed that she had no choice. Unless she could think of something, which was when she remembered the obvious. We've never worked as a team with Naruto. Idiot. Naruto interjected, and INO rounded on the boy, ready to lash into him, unprepared for when he lashed into her. The best teamwork develops in battle. Besides, you can't always rely on it. Like Anko says, the Yondem didn't kill the QB with anyone's help. INO fell silent, staring at the boy, then snorting glared at her passage sensei and the ever-silent Shino before storming off. Stupid, idiotic. The only thing that could sum up her thoughts and feelings on the matter was one word. Men. Staring at the boy across from him, Harate couldn't help but feel put off. He had never met a ninja that wore orange nor had such bright yellow hair. Now his personality, it reminded him strongly of a former superior within Unbu named Anko. He was loud, ambitious and just a tad cocky. Yet Harate also had a feeling that despite all of that, he was a capable ninja like his sensei. Which was why he wanted to see Naruto's skill alone, because if he was really like Anko, then once the fight started he would lose track of everybody around him. Oi, so you really want me to come at you with everything? Naruto asked cautiously, no, almost as if he was afraid. Yeah, something like that. Harate coughed, slipping into a casual stance. Just come at me however you go after Anko-senpai. Seconds later he realized what he was facing. It was a mere split second, but in that moment Harate saw a gaze reminiscent of Anko. It was in that Harate began plotting the various angles of attack that Naruto would be following when, much to his disbelief, Naruto charged straight at him. Talk about an idiot. The Jonin didn't even bother to pay attention to how Naruto was moving. It was obvious the boy hadn't learned anything from Anko. So he casually reached out to a simple left jab, aimed at the boy's chin, which was when he realized his mistake. 1 minute Naruto had been a sitting duck, the next he was inside Hayate's defenses. It was literally only due to his faster reaction time that he managed to move out of range while staring warily at the frustrated Genin. How could he have been so stupid? Of course, if Naruto had been trained by Anko, he would be using the heavy style. So distracted with cursing his stupidity, Harate just barely had time to register the roundhouse kick that was sailing at his stomach. Still, he was a Jonin and former Unbu, so he managed to avoid the kick only to receive a hook punch to his kidney. Wincing, the man lashed out with a hammer fist to the boy's fall, sending the boy tumbling away from him. Sadly, Naruto recovered quickly, and with a smirk that would do Anko proud came charging back in, kunai coming into play as projectiles. Harate dodged them expertly, almost frightened to see that he even threw like Anko, but was brought up short when he realized that Naruto had used those weapons as a distraction. Because now the blonde was within range once more and was moving for a round kick, which changed into a side kick when Harate shifted to avoid the blow. Realizing his only recourse would be to put some distance between them, Harate leapt backward, a trickle of sweat made its way down the side of his face. Damn, was it him or was the boy getting faster? He was given further reason to sweat, when Naruto quickly preformed an all-too-familiar handseal and shouted his move. Cave Bunshine. Oh, that wasn't good. Landing, Harate quickly sought the hilt of his sword, amazed that Anko would teach a genin that move. His amazement turned into almost horror at what happened next. Apparently the 4 clones felt this was not enough bodies and moved to create even more. That was not the version of Cave Bunshine that all Jonin used, that was. Harate felt his fingers slacken slightly as he realized what he was facing. Normal Cave Bunshines could not make copies. The only version that could was the one that Kakashi-senpai used, which was a deviation that the Yondem had created. So for Naruto to be able to preform that version, this was a whole different game. Get him. Harate got a hold of himself, pulling his sword as the small mob charged at him. Thank the kami he had the good sense to fight the boy in private. This was quickly getting out of hand. Seconds later he was deflecting kunai, blocking punches and kicks, all the while trying to figure out how to handle this situation. Then suddenly the fighting slacked off, and he froze, eyes darting to 5 Narutos that were moving into position even as the others backed off. It didn't take a genius to realize what was about to happen, and with a quick Shunshin no Jutsu he escaped the coming blast at the last second. Perching on an overhead branch, he panted, studying the various surviving clones intently and almost shocked at the brutality that Jutsu had behind it. That move had nothing but an intent to kill behind it. He knew of very few ninja that would go for that type of attack, and none were genin. Naruto was baring his fangs. Was this how he sparred Anko? Harate frowned, then coughed, watching as Naruto gathered the remaining clones and seemed to hold a discussion with them. This was not a good sign. A genin, with a forbidden level Cave Bunshine, the style of one of the most ruthless ninja ever, and a viciousness unheard of in a genin. How much more could this boy do? Apparently a lot, as all the clones suddenly turned and launched a hail of kunai at him. Okay, it was time to stop playing around. He needed to put this boy on the defensive. Narrowing his eyes, Harate gathered his chakra, channeled it into his sword, and then slashed it out. Dance of the Midnight Tornado. There was a moment of nothing, and then the chakra in the sword was sent flashing into the air, creating a small tornado, which deflected the kunai back toward the orange ninja. Pushing off the tree with a burst of chakra, he followed in their wake, pleased to see he had caught them off guard. Landing the Jonin, making sure to use the dull side of his blade, lashed out to being dispelling the various clones. Bastard! The remaining Narutos shouted, before they all came charging as one. That made things easier, and, before long he was standing completely alone in the clearing, which made him pause. Naruto was missing completely. Well, not really. Harate could vaguely feel his presence. That was highly unusual in all honesty. Even if Naruto was hiding in the shrubs or trees, Harate should have a clearer feeling than this. It wasn't until he felt the air behind him ripple from a kunai that he figured out the problem. Reacting quickly, he twisted around, just barely dodging the attack, and then he performed several more near impossible evasions and swore. What was Anko thinking, teaching that jutsu to a genin? Okay, Hayate was awfully worried. Everything about Naruto was beginning to scream danger, which meant he had to end this now. For all he knew, Naruto could have created more damn clones, had them use the Misegaku, and were preparing to slaughter him with kunai. Twirling his blade, he pointed the tip down, channeling chakra into the sword once more. Seconds later, he drove the blade into the ground, allowing the chakra to burst outwards, ripping the ground to pieces as it spread. Dance of the Moon Dragon Crash. He was rewarded with more than 10 Narutos appearing out of thin air before disappearing in puffs of smoke to leave only a dazed and confused blonde. Without hesitating, he pulled his sword free and shifted his weight, already preparing for his next attack, even as Naruto recovered and began an unfamiliar jutsu. Which meant this next moment was crucial. Dance of the Midnight Tornado. Ho! Naruto shouted in mid-seal, eyes wide before he was knocked over and battered along the ground as Hayat's attack slammed into him. Harate didn't even wait for the blonde to come to a complete stop as he channeled the rest of his chakra into his legs of a powerful jump into the air. His sword arched overhead and came to a crashing stop as he landed in a kneeling posture over the blonde, the dull edge of his sword pressing painfully against Naruto's shoulder. The boy remained perfectly still, only moving when Harate started coughing and returned his sword to its sheath. Seeing the dark look on the boy's face, he coughed and sought something to say and thus potently keep this child from seeking him out to retribution. That was a very impressive match. Naruto stared at him through squinted eyes for several moments before putting his hands behind his head. Hair. I'll be Hokage, no doubt. Harate blinked and coughed once more. After that fight, he had no problem seeing the boy getting strong enough for that job. I'll see you tomorrow at 10. Right. Naruto shouted, jumping to his feet, nodding as he started for the village. First I'll have some ramen, then I'll train, then I'll. Harate watched and listened until the boy was long gone. Looking around at the training area, he frowned, then glanced in the direction that Naruto had just went. That fight? Nobody would have expected that from a genin without any family. Naruto used his jutsu frighteningly well. He didn't rely on them, which was a flaw a lot of ninja had, and most importantly, Naruto thought ahead at times. After all, how else could he have known to use the Misegaku when he had? The blonde had thought ahead, knowing that Harate would either dodge or reflect the attack, and he had came up with the right tactic for that situation. That was something most people would expect from a Hyuga or Uchiha, not from a clanless ninja. Well, we has tactics covered now, Harate said before coughing. Now if he could just keep from pissing of INO jail, be fine. Chapter 8, like Naruto you are such. Pacing near the wall beside the north gate leading out of Konoha, INO kept glanced at her watch every 5 minutes and snorting. Leave it to Naruto to totally mess everything up, they should have left an hour ago. Grumbling, INO glared at her sensei in utter annoyance, yet the chronically sick Unen seemed completely impervious to her glare. He was even content to remain crouching in the shade of the gates, listening to Shino talk with the bug crawling along his finger. The silence continued onward for another half hour before INO's temper finally snapped and she stomped her foot on the ground, her teeth grinding. That baka. If we has to wait one more minute. What were you thinking taking such an idiot on our team? At this Harate coughed, looking up at her curiously. When INO cocked her hip and crossed her arms, an obvious sign of her dangerous displeasure, Harate started talking. Each team is designed to be balanced. We're balanced by having one of the biggest morons in Konoha on our team. INO demanded curtly, eyes narrowing. Cha? I don't see it. Each team is designed so that there is one ninja for gathering information, one for creating a strategy using that information, and one that can create the tactics needed to make the strategy succeed. INO, you're perfect to gathering information, while Shino is perfect to strategy and Naruto is perfect for tactics. So that is why the teams were designed like they were. Shino said after a moment before nodding. It makes sense that design would allow each team to be given almost any type of mission and has an almost assured chance of completing it successfully. But still, why'd we have to get Naruto? Why couldn't you get Sasuke, and let Sakura has Naruto? Ino grumbled, looking away. That would has messed up the teams. Sasuke's team has begun handling C-ranked missions, messing with it would not be in anyone's best interest. Harate said, covering his mouth while coughing yet again. Well, of course they are, they have the number 1 genin. Ino protested darkly. We're like, getting another idiot that'll probably get himself killed instead of just injuring himself. Actually, we're getting the number 1 genin. Harate said, and then seeing her dark look sighed. Uchiha Sasuke was the number 1 academy student, but Uzumaki Naruto is actually the number 1 genin. It's the teamwork that makes Team 7 the premier team. What are you talking about? Shino inquired curiously. Well, how can I explain? Harate said, rubbing at his nose. Sasuke-san and Team 7 has just begun preforming C-ranked missions, while Naruto has completed one B-ranked mission successfully and is about to perform another. So as it stands, Naruto is the top genin. Naruto, the top genin. As if. Ino said slowly, eyes wide. Well, another factor is skills. Both has been taught above genin level, but Sasuke-san has been taught more conservative skills compared to Naruto. Oi. Sorry about being late. I was having some rain. Naruto shouted, interrupting the conversation as he jogged toward them, shudding items in his pockets. Skidding to a halt, he blinked, really seeing that they were all staring at him. Do I have something on my face? We should get going. Harate said, standing up once more. Naruto, you take the lead. Right. Naruto said enthusiastically, facing toward the gates, finger raised. Let's go. Ino just barely repressed her groan of frustration. She didn't care what Harate said. There was no way she could believe that Naruto was better than Sasuke. The boy was a hyperactive monkey, his voice grating, and could he not grasp that orange was not a good color? Hell, she hadn't spent more than a few minutes with the blonde, and Ino's eyes were already starting to burn from the color. Why did she have to has the moron on her team? Reaching up, Ino rubbed her temples, biting her tongue against the urge to shout at the boy as he led the way beyond the gates. About 20 minutes later, Naruto started singing a nursery rhyme in a grating voice, and Ino felt her eyes starting to twitch. Abayum Shino had not graduated as the best student, nor had he graduated with a clever nickname. Shino had to the vast majority of the graduating class been just another guy. This had been fine with Shino, he preferred the quiet. It was a preference that he had picked up from his exposure to both his father and his Kaikechu family. So needless to say, listening to Naruto sing put his hard-gained stoicism to the test. High up is the castle wall, that brightly showed up who drawed the classes try. The moon is prising high in the depths of night. To rise and fall is people's fate, the moon shines so bright. How I love the moon minus. Shino winced. Naruto sounded like a banshee, or the screeching ghost of a torture victim. His voice even affected his Kaikechi, who demanding the blonde's immediate death. Shino didn't even want to think of how this was affecting Ino. Will you please shut up? Ino shouted, shoving Shino aside as Naruto turned in surprise. Apparently Ino had been driven crazy. Which was understandable after listening to the same screeching words for the last 4 or 5 hours. Oi, you has a problem with me singing. Duh. First, you can't sing, and second, those aren't even the right words. Ino snapped back. Oi. Those are to the words. Naruto shouted back. I'm not. So. I'm not. They are to the right words. If you think you can sing it better, then why don't you? Naruto shouted, not backing down one iota from Ino. Are you really going to? Shino started to ask, already sensing that was the case. When Ino shot him a glare, he sighed, allowing the two to continue their tirade. Ino, apparently satisfied that Shino was silent, snapped her attention back to Naruto, hands on her hips. Cherry blossoms gracefully bloom all the fields that lie. High up is the castle wall, where has warriors gone? Where is the moonlight that brightly shone up high, shone upon the warriors who drained the glasses dry? Naruto's mouth opened in surprise, which Shino felt like mirroring. Ino's voice had been soft and gently. It was almost like listening to a professional singer. Can we please continue with the mission now? Harate said, coughing, startling all three. Naruto snapped his mouth shut and turned, marching off ahead, but this time he was silent. Ino crossed her arms and allowed Shino to resume his spot directly behind the other boy. Once Shino had gotten over his surprise at Ino's voice, he considered the fact that Naruto and Ino seemed to argue and fight almost every time they turned around. Usually Naruto would provoke Ino, but he could count at least one instance where Naruto had been provoked. Shino felt uneasy about that. They were a team after all and they had to work together. Those two would never be able to do that, which made one fact obvious. Unless Shino made the effort to bridge the gap between the two, they would never be a team. He just didn't have an idea of how to do just that. Ino had never been a fan of teamwork, but she had grudgingly worked with him. However, with Naruto in the formula now, that would never happen. They would probably go against anything he suggested, if it was backed by the other. Still, Shino knew he had to do something, and that meant private team training. No karate. No friends. Total isolation so that they could learn to get along, or to at least set aside personality conflicts. The most likely to agree with the least amount of resistance would probably be Ino. That decision made, he checked in briefly with his Kaikeichi family that he had spread out around them. There was nothing out of the ordinary going on, a few wild animals, but no people other than an old man gathering fruit. Turning his mind away from those, he checked on his teammates, finding things in proper order. "OW!" Naruto suddenly shouted, slapping at his neck. Shino was far out of his thoughts, watching as the bug he had placed on Naruto darted off the blonde and back into the safety of Shino's body. Shino spent a few minutes watching Naruto grumble, then turned his attention back to the bug in question, Kumi-chan. Kumi-chan was apologetic, explaining that Naruto's chakra had goaded her into biting. Shino scowled, asking other members of his family to see how they would react to Naruto's chakra. As a handful left, he wondered what kind of chakra could be so powerful as to override his family's training. Shino had his question answered minutes later, when Naruto started slapping at his neck while his family returned to him. He waited patiently for the few he had sent out to settle, and then gently prodded the oldest involved, Mako-chan. Her answer, that part of Naruto's chakra urged us to go, only deepened Shino's confusion. Shifting his attention back to Naruto, Shino wondered at the impossibility of it. His family had been exposed to karate and sasuke, both had large chakra capacities, and yet they had never had this problem. What made Naruto's chakra any different? Why did they want to goad when they never had before? There was something odd about Naruto. Something strange. Shino suddenly felt very uneasy. Naruto was smiling, he was laughing, being a nuisance to his teammates, but he didn't care. Because he was on a mission, so he was pretending while hiding the tight, hard knot in his stomach. It wasn't fear, it was more like dread. But it was there in a knot. A dread that he would have to do it again, spend another night of uneasy sleep dreaming about another ninja's death. A death he would cause, that he would have to cause. Like Anko had taught him in Kusa better than him, he would hate it, but he would do it. It was hard to create the part of his mind that he would need to survive the splattering of blood, but Naruto thought he was halfway there. So he kept his game of pretend going, wondering if the others were able to take a life. Well, that and why the hell they had to do all this damn walking. Why couldn't they just be there already? He hated these long periods of nothing, it was so boring. Oh well, at least someone had bothered to acknowledge him as an experienced ninja. Soon he really would be Hokage and everybody would see his strength. The thought of him being Hokage was enough that he started chuckling to himself, imagining his future self kicking Sasuke's ass. Then Sakura would be fawning all over him, and then. He scowled, blinking as he realized he had never really thought of what would come after that long dreamed of day. Oh well, it didn't really matter, he'd figure that out when he got there. It was around this point that his thoughts were interrupted by his stomach growling in hunger. Putting a hand to it, Naruto grumbled, slightly glancing at the sky, startled that it was actually darkening. He hadn't realized just how long they had been walking. The upside would be that they would be stopping soon, so they could eat. This was a good thing since he really didn't want to complain. Anko had done a lot to dissuade him of that. He felt a tremor run up his spine at the mere memory. I think it's time we stop for the night," Harate said, bringing the group to a halt. Finally Ino muttered, sitting down on an overturned log. Naruto rolled his eyes as he slung his pack off to collapse at the base of a nearby tree, hunting for a cup of his instant ramen. Finding it, he grinned happily and started noisily satisfying his stomach's grumbling. Was there anything better than ramen? Well, maybe a kiss from Sakura, not that he would really know. Debating the two options, Naruto realized that he was being watched and snapped his attention up to find INO glaring at him. What the hell? Naruto glared back, unintimidated. Snorting, INO looked away, watching Shino talk to his bugs and Harate start a fire. Naruto muttered something and then went back to his meal, ignoring the apparently obvious fact that INO didn't like him. He didn't has a clue why, and he didn't care. She was another damn Sasuke fangirl, and she was not Sakura, so she was beneath his contempt, and his chopsticks of ramen poured halfway to his mouth, a sudden thought hitting him. What if he smelled really bad? Anko would have slapped him upside the head. If she didn't, then he usually didn't care what he smelled like. Still, he didn't want to be the smelly guy. Lifting his arm, Naruto sniffed his armpit, only to frown. Obviously that wasn't it. That was when he felt her attention again, and looked up to catch her staring at him in confusion. What the hell are you staring at? Naruto snapped. You. INO shot back. Kami, you're disgusting. You're like a stupid monkey. Hey, at least I'm not pining over some gay pretty boy. Naruto shot back, and then when she opened her mouth to say something, he cut her off. Save it. INO's face reddened even more, then started to angrily pull things out of her pack, muttering. Naruto made it a point to eat as horribly as possible, ignoring her. Briefly he wondered if Anko would help him hide INO's body if he killed her, then decided that she might point out that he would have to kill Shino and Harate as well. Well, there went that idea. He would have just ignore that annoying girl. Well, that and piss her off, so as far as Naruto was concerned, anything that pissed her off was a good thing. Finishing his ramen, Naruto tossed it beside him and grabbed another cup, scowling in thought as he ate. What was Anko doing? She had seemed so upset. Yeah, upset. Anko had been upset last night about him and this team. Why couldn't he have just stayed with her? Sure, she was a psychotic bitch, trying to kill him every time he turned around, but she was alright. He paused, tilting his head in consideration. Yeah, Anko really wasn't that bad. She was fun and she enjoyed his pranks, approved of his brashness. He chose to ignore how she liked to try and get him on a regular basis. Then he realized who he was thinking such things about and shivered in fear, his appetite almost ruined. Shaking it off, he focused on his meal and finished it quickly. Setting it aside, he settled back and made the quick decision that he was far too tired for much of anything else, and thus made advantage of one of Anko's many lessons. Instant sleep, even if it took an act of the kami to wake him back up again. This act of the kami came several hours later, in the form of his bladder. Naruto of course jerked awake, stumbling into the forest, sighing in relief while his eyes refused to focus. Finished and mumbling to himself, he returned to camp, scratching at his stomach as he blew past the fire and into a tent that he swore was his. Naruto quickly shed his orange jacket and shoes, then after a moment's consideration his shirt as well. Chuckling sleepily to himself, Naruto then proceeded to climb into his sleeping bag and curl up with the warm and soft pillow he found inside. After that he was once more lost to the realm of sleep and dreaming very odd dreams. Very, very odd dreams. But that damn pillow sure was comfortable. INO woke up slowly to the odd, yet pleasant sensations of warm breath tickling the nape of her neck, and something hard pressed tightly against her. It felt like a kunai, yet she had no question that the breath on her neck was nice. Which meant in her sleep-clouded brain, it was Sasuke. That wasn't quite right, however, she realized a few seconds later through her sleep haze. The black-haired god was miles away, possibly still in Konoha, and whatever was pressing against her didn't quite feel like a kunai. Hesitating, she shifted in the sleeping bag, before cautiously slipping a hand behind her. She then slid her hand away. She laid there, her mind working furiously. Sasuke wasn't around, and if he was, he wasn't likely to turn up in her bed. Naruto, dumb as he was, would have more sense than to do something so perverted and stupid. So that left either Shino or Harate. But the person behind her didn't feel like he was even as tall as her. Opening her blue eyes slowly, she stared at the side of her tent for a moment, wondering. The simple answer would be to just unzip the bag, climb out, and see who it was. Shifting slightly, which meant she had to press against the kunai even more, she tugged at the zipper and found it stuck. Frowning, she stopped, then she felt the male behind her stirring. As he woke up, she heard a yawn followed by a moment of silence. INO felt the way he quit breathing, though his kunai never seemed to change. Then she started seeing red when she heard a familiar male voice whispering a prayer. INO narrowed her eyes, anger and embarrassment building inside her. INO might have even let him escape unharmed to avoid the embarrassment. Until the kunai pressed against her like she was a holster. Uzumaki Naruto, you are a dead man. That shouted. The sleeping bag was ripped asunder as Naruto promptly tried to escape and INO grabbed him around the neck to alternate strangling and beating him senseless. In Naruto's defense, his innocent act was flawless, but INO didn't care. All that mattered was killing the blonde pervert. He tried to make another break for it during a moment, while INO caught her breath. He was promptly rewarded with a swift blow to his crotch from behind. Whimpering in pain, he had no choice but to suffer the continued wrath of INO, who, as was widely known, had no mercy when she was pissed. An hour later, finally finished beating the boy to within an inch of death, INO dusted her hands off, turned and marched out of her tent. Who did that bastard think he was? Did he just think she wouldn't beat him? Her anger was only compounded when she found Harate and Shino staring at her. What the hell are you looking at? INO shouted at Shino, actually radiating enough killer intent to make him flinch before wisely turning back to his bugs. INO huffed, trying to calm down. She tried to rationalize a reason why he would turn up like that in her tent. Sadly, it was impossible. INO could see no damn reason why he would ever show up in her sleeping bag. Running her fingers through her hair, she huffed, noticing the slate-colored sky as she marched into the forest, looking for a stream. Maybe those guys could stand to go without a bath, but INO demanded one, especially after having that Naruto pressed against her. 20 minutes later, she stopped and stomped her foot in frustration, glaring heavenward. Why me? Ho. Why? In answer, there was a clap of thunder signaling the beginning of the early morning shower. Oh, that was just perfect. First she got a pervert as a teammate and now she was going to get drenched. Was she such a bad person that she had to be punished like this? Grumbling, knowing defeat when faced with it, INO sloshed her way through the rain, avoiding the mud as best she could. She could handle getting wet, she could handle Naruto, but if her clothes were ruined by mud she would go ballistic. Harate normally liked going out on missions, even easy ones like this, because they always seemed to help him. He could breathe easier, felt more energy, and even with the humid air, it was no different. Save that he now had a throbbing headache, one that had nothing to do with being sickness. No, this headache had one source. A source dressed in bright orange, had the worst singing voice he had ever heard and constantly pissed off INO. A girl who had a way of screeching that made even Naruto's singing voice sound pleasant. Harate honestly could not see why Anko had not killed the blonde immediately. He knew Anko, they had worked together once, she was not a very tolerant person. As a matter of fact, the only person she had ever seemed to get along with like a normal person was Kakashi. So why she had not only allowed Naruto to live, but trained him to the level he was at completely baffled Harate. Reaching up with his free hand, Harate rubbed at the bridge of his nose, wondering why he had ever let Yuge talk him into being a Jonin sensei. A wry smile found its way to his face as he remembered exactly how she had convinced him. Thinking about her, Harate felt a brief moment of interest in what exactly she was even thinking about their relationship. He shrugged it off, however, shifting back into serious ninja mode. Eyes darting around, Harate concentrated on finding the landmark that had been in the mission scroll. He had just started to think that they weren't close yet when he saw the undo marker hidden in the bark of a tree. Glancing at the sky, he nodded to himself before looking around. They had made good time, despite having to wait for the rain to end and the Naruto to recover. Harate considered the various factors and decided that they could probably make it a bit further after they met the contact, and then they would have to stop for the night. 3 days wasn't so bad, especially for a genin team. It would probably take a week to settle things and then another 3 days, so they'd be gone a total of 13 days. Maybe Yuge was right about this being a kind of vacation, 13 days in the field, on a C-rank mission that they would receive B-rank pay for. After a few more minutes of travel, Harate finally spotted their contact before anyone else. The man was short, balding and heavyset. However, there was something about his bearing that told Harate there was more to his man than normal. Seconds later, the others noticed him and came to a stop, allowing Harate to move forward to meet the man. "You must be the ninja from Konoha," the balding man said anxiously, rubbing his hands together while eyeing Harate. "I'm the headman of Nigariki Yakunatama Jovi. I'm Gekko Harate," the sick-day Unin said, covering his mouth as he coughed. "This is Yamanaka INO obeying Shino and Uzumaki Naruto." "Ah. Good. Good. I was beginning to worry," Jovi said, smiling faintly, fishing out a colored silk handkerchief to dab at his forehead. I'm so pleased that you arrived safely. Bandit raids are increasing lately. Harate nodded, filing that information away for future consideration. Perhaps we should start to the village then. Of course. Jovi said, almost brightening. Just follow me and don't worry. We should be there by the time the sun sets tomorrow. The way you say that sounds like it's not soon enough. Ino suddenly interjected, causing the man to pause and glance at her with a reassuring smile. I don't like being out of the village longer than I have to be. Ino didn't like the path the instant they started down it. First off, it was narrow and she was forced to follow close behind Shino in single file. Second off, the trees, which could barely support a pair of blackened leaves, formed a sort of gloomy tunnel, and the path wound its way around the trunks. The air was so oppressive that after several minutes their feet jumped against the ground loudly. Even Naruto was subdued by the atmosphere. Ino felt her heart take an upswing every time she saw a slender beam of light that broke its way through the leaves far above and avoided being caught in the matted twigs and tangled limbs. All too soon, however, these shafts of light ceased and Ino was forced to endure the gloom without solace and at times forced to grab the back of Shino's jacket to keep from getting lost. It felt like they had been traveling for hours and Ino was past the point of caring about much of anything. All she wanted was to reach the village so she could take a warm bath and relax. It seemed that a god heard Ino's silent wish, for soon enough, they reached a much brighter stretch of forest, and Ino felt herself cheering up at this. Without the undergrowth, the shadow was nowhere near as deep, and while the light was greenish, it was at least light. Ino also took comfort in the fact that they now had a semi-fresh breeze. Thankfully, they passed through what remained of the forest in another hour, and she was once more bathed in the wonderful rays of the sun, even if it was starting to dip beyond the horizon. I think we should stop for the night, Jovi said, while wiping at the back of his neck with the handkerchief and glancing around at the field. We should reach the village by noon tomorrow. Oi, why can't we keep going? Naruto asked. Jovi nervously rubbed at his hands. Well, we has to cross a deep ravine using a rope bridge. Ino froze, her pack half off her shoulder, staring at the man suspiciously. Like, why do I get the feeling there's something about this bridge you're not telling us? Oh. It's not exactly whole. Jovi explained, laughing nervously. I nearly fell 5 times getting to this side of the ravine. Right, Naruto said, giving a thumbs up. Well, then I guess it's a good idea to stop for the night. Ino rolled her eyes and turned back to unpacking her sleeping mat, not wanting a repeat of what had happened last night. Locating the flattest and driest surface that she could, she unrolled it, pleased that Harate was smart enough to set up the campfire nearby. Setting down on her mat, Ino lifted her pack and started shifting through it to the essentials: food, water, a mirror and brush. She couldn't wait to get back indoors, then she could have a bath, wash her clothes and take proper care of her hair. Grumbling, she worked the ponytail loose and ran the brush through, wincing at every knot that she had to struggle with. I'm hungry, Naruto grumbled, flopping down near her with a splattering of mud, a cup of ramen in his hand. Ino froze as the mud hit the edge of her sleeping mat, then glared at him. Ugh. Don't you has anyone else to annoy? Naruto paused, looking up, about to say something with a mouthful of ramen, causing Ino to grimace. You are so disgusting. Don't you ever eat anything else? Narrowing his eyes, Naruto gulped his food down without chewing. Oi, like you're any better. Besides, don't you know that ramen is the perfect meal? A gift from the gods. Ino rolled her eyes, turning back to her mirror. There was no point in trying to argue with that moron. Wincing at a particularly cruel knot, she wondered why she had to be punished like this. Finishing up, she shoved her brush into the pack, then looked around to see what was going on. Finding everyone settling in to their own meals, Ino shook her head and pulled her knees up, resting her chin on them, staring at the fire. She was starting to doze when Harate decided to speak up, his voice firing her back into the real world. Jovi-san, would you mind telling us a little bit about what is going on? Interest piqued, Ino shifted her attention to the heavy-set man who looked startled. He nodded after a moment, then set his own meal aside before clearing his throat. Of course. The headman said, looking up, his face highlighted oddly by the flames. Well, the village is located on the edge of an ancient forest that surrounds the ruins of an old castle. The village has served as a trading center for the local logging crews, and it was doing very well. Everybody was happy and safe. Then about 6 months ago, there were random disappearances, at first a hunting party here or a farmer and his family there. Oi, and you didn't tell anyone sooner. Naruto demanded heatedly, only to has Dovi brush him off calmly. People disappear quite often. They leave for other villages or sometimes fall into the ravine that isolates our village, or get caught in a rock slide in the mountains that back the forest. Jovi shrugged, shifting his gaze back to Harate. However, when the flow of wood began to disappear, we grew extremely worried and searched the camps. We found nothing, no clues as to where they went, just empty camps. A perfect example of a C-ranked mission. Harate nodded, coughing before he settled down. So why did you upgrade the level? There were several reasons. The main reason, however, was the village elders urged for it since the merchant guilds were getting very unruly. An example of this was that one guild hired several freelance fighters who turned out to be nothing more than bandits. Jovi shrugged, sighing. I was forced to upgrade the mission, though I highly doubt it's be ranked. I even explained that to the man that I spoke to, and he agreed. So that is why they allowed my team to continue the mission, despite its rank. Harate mused, glancing at the three genin. Well, I think we'll be able to handle things. After we reach the village, we'll decide what to do. INO sighed and closed her eyes, thank the gods that it wasn't raining. Then she felt a drop of water on her forehead, followed by another, and she sighed. Of course. The ropes creaked as the rope bridge swayed over the deep ravine, whose bottom disappeared into a thick fog while ahead just barely visible were the craggy mountain peaks that overlooked this stretch of land. Harate paused, clutching both sides of the bridge, following the mountain range until it disappeared from sight due to distance. The mission report hadn't been lying, this village really was isolated. Shaking it off, he started forward once more, keeping a close eye on the creaking boards and the four people in front of him. Jovi was taking things slow but confidential, Naruto was grumbling but otherwise behaved, INO was silent, her hands clutching the ropes, and Shino was walking calmly. He really hoped that they didn't overtax this bridge. He had no desire to find the bottom of the ravine. He hated to think of how anyone ever managed trade with such a bridge, especially a logging village. It presented a problem, at least until Harate realized the simple solution. If the forest butted against the edge of the ravine, then a simple pulley system could be set up and the logs could be sent across to an awaiting wagon from the customer. It would be simple, direct, and most importantly, it would keep their monopoly on the logging trade. Stepping off the bridge, following Shino, Harate paused, glancing at the two haggard-looking men on either side. Obviously an attempt at keeping the bridge in the village's control, the men offered a polite greeting to Jovi and the heavyset man returned it warmly. Harate took the moment to study the layout of the land, noting that the forest would block any direct line of sight with the bridge. Well, shall we? I'm sure we're all ready to be in Nigariki. Jovi suddenly said, his tone more energetic as he set off at a brisk pace. INO groaned before staggering after the man, which worried Harate. He had known INO had lower stamina and chakra than the rest of the team. She barely put any effort into her training after all, but he had thought she was at least tough enough to handle a bit of a march. Naruto was practically bouncing with each step, which according to the Kusa mission report he had read was to be expected. INO, however, was almost dragging her feet, forcing Harate to consider options. If he tried to force her into training, she might give up. He would have to speak with Yuge and see what she could suggest. Kami, how he hated having girls on his team, he was never sure how to handle them. Of course, if she could find some sort of motivation, he would have nothing to worry about. Coughing, Harate frowned. Well, INO had shown some interest in Kenbutsu. Maybe if he spoke to her about it again, she would ask for him to train her. He hoped so she would be perfect for it, since Kenbutsu required very little stamina compared to Taibutsu and Ninbutsu. We're almost there now, Jovi said brightly from the lead, picking up the pace. Harate remained silent, putting though TS about INO out of his mind, and instead thought about how best to go about this mission. Gathering information would be needed, stuff that Jovi left out since Headman almost always omitted something. Nodding to himself, he relaxed, pleased when they finally swung north and then back south so that the village was suddenly within sight. It was located in a pleasant-looking valley, with high walls made of what appeared to be only recently seasoned timber with sharp points. Obviously they were designed to deter either animals or humans. The gates looked solid, with sentry slits. Following Jovi, Harate was unsurprised by the security, both visible and invisible. The genin, however, seemed unaware of how many eyes and arrows were targeted on them at that moment. Except Naruto, who gave an empty patch of the village wall a middle finger as he walked. Drawing to a stop before the wall, they watched as a man's head suddenly appeared above the wall to stare down at them. Jovi-san, is that you? Yes, Iki-san. Jovi said tiredly, wiping at his forehead with his rag. Isn't that obvious? Sorry, Aki said, cheeks flushing faintly. Then, clearing his throat, he spoke up. I need the password for this week. Aki, if you can see it is me. And these are the Konoha ninja. Must you insist on this? Jovi asked, his tone exasperated. Yes. Sorry, Jovi-san, but you were the one that told me to do this to everybody. Aki said apologetically. Fine. Jovi muttered, glancing at them before shuffling forward to whisper the word through the gate to whoever was on the other side. Seconds later, Aki disappeared behind the wall before reappearing. 1 minute. He must have broken something to be this proper. Jovi muttered before brightening, as he gestured with an expansive hand as the gate swung open. Welcome the village of Nigariki. Harate followed the others inside, followed by Jovi and closing the gates. The Jonin had expected as much. The streets were almost empty, the buildings seemed solid enough, but there was obviously very little business going on with the loss of the loggers. Besides that, there was a sense of despair blanketing the area. The few people on the street were jittery and their eyes kept darting all around them, searching for the hidden attackers that plagued their lives. They were all on edge, which seemed to put the 3 young ninja on edge as well. Harate had seen this sort of thing before, so he merely turned his attention back to an expectant Jovi. I see what you mean. Once we've had a chance to rest properly, we'll set out and take a look around. Harate said, coughing before he glanced causally in a random direction. Jovi nodded and turned, gesturing to them to follow him once more. Of course. We've selected the best inn we could for your use. It's on the north side of the village, isolated and secured. It also has a hot spring that bubbles from the rock into a natural bath. Harate noted Ino's sudden upswing in attention and repressed his sigh. A minute later they were standing at the doorway of the room inside a medium-sized inn that looked almost unused. The room itself was small and rather meager compared to other inns, but it was well kept and clean. It also was warm, which was a plus since the nights were growing steadily colder. On the clean hardwood floors rested 2 neatly made futons, one of which rested under the only window in the entire room. Harate nodded to himself, turning to face the 3 genin that were hovering near the doorway. INO was glaring at Naruto, who was talking animatedly with an impassive-looking Shino. Maybe it was time that they were sent far away, or at least far enough away that Harate could concentrate on things. Why don't you 3 go get dinner? Harate finally offered, coughing yet again. I'd like sushi. Oi. Why do we have to do that? Naruto piped up, disagreeable as always. Harate repressed his sigh and instead slipped his pack off and placed it on the futon near the window. Because you might also learn some information that Jovi-san didn't want to share. Seeing the recognition on the blonde's face, Harate breathed easier, or as easy as he could considering his health. Do you really think that Jovi-san was keeping something from us? INO asked curiously. Surprisingly, it was Shino that answered. Of course. Everyone keeps something from people they shouldn't. Harate only coughed, which earned him disgruntled looks from the genin before they left. In the gathering gloom just before sunset, a small side gate opened noiselessly as the guard deliberately turned his back to allow a lone figure dressed in a traveling cloak to slip unchallenged out of the village and into the silent forest. The figure, a bald, heavy-set man, hurried among the trees, keeping his cloak around him tightly. The figure moved quickly and sure-footed through a maze of paths, barely disturbing a leaf. He had been one of the village's best hunters when he had been younger. Finally, after several long minutes in which the gloom of the forest had deepened, he reached the prearranged location and stopped. You're late, Jovi-san. A deep voice said, hidden among the shadows of the nearby trees. Jovi turned toward the voice, his face set into a slight scowl. I can't leave just whenever you like. There are problems I have to handle. Things that must be dealt with before minus. Yes. The mysterious man, dressed in a hooded cloak, said, stepping into view. We has noticed that you brought more people in. I had no choice. Jovi started to protest until the man cut him off. We asked you to keep outsiders away for the moment. Which I told you was impossible. Jovi snapped. However, these people are unique. I think she'll forgive me for these interesting people. Define interesting. The mysteriously hooded man responded. Ninja. Ninja. Yes. Jovi nodded anxiously. The hooded man paused as if listening to something, then turned as if to leave. Then we will let you live. Let me live. Jovi paused, smiling faintly. You are so gracious. The man tensed, turning to stare at Jovi intently. Do not make the mistake that you are beyond our touch. She is free and there are always those that are willing to serve her. Oh, I am sure. Jovi said, lifting his chin defiantly. However, I am Minato Yakanatama no Jovi, last surviving heir of the Minato clan. Do not forget with whom you speak. The man was silent for several long minutes before he spoke, his tone oddly amused. Do not worry, Minato Yakanatama no Jovi, neither she nor I shall forget with whom we speak. Chapter 9, Dire Discoveries. The countryside of Fire Country was very beautiful in the morning. Idyllic was the word most often used. The way the reds and blues mixed, bringing out the dark green of the forest. Even more enchanting was the stillness of the forest floor and how, if you were lucky enough to be strolling early in the morning, you could stumble across a deer. Yes, idyllic was the word to use. Not that Naruto cared. As far as the blonde was concerned, the animals and the sunrise could jump off a cliff and die. All he wanted was to be curled up under a warm blanket, sleeping like a log. Yawning, he stumbled, but caught himself and kept moving, keeping his place in the diamond formation while wondering why they had to start so early in the morning. They had been out here for a week, and so far they had found several empty camps, but no clues. Would it really make any difference if they checked out these abandoned camps later in the day? He wasn't asking for sunset, but damn it, would noon has been so bad? He would have asked Harate, but just couldn't bring himself to. Silently cursing the man, Naruto tried to force himself to stop thinking about it, but, like anyone that tried to avoid thinking about a certain subject, Naruto couldn't help it. INO was one thing. He expected her to treat him this way. After all, she had never treated him all that well. Shino ignoring him was nothing new either. After all, the odd boy had ignored him and everyone else for as long as Naruto could remember. That didn't mean he liked it, however, and the more he dwelled on it, the more aggravated he became. He couldn't wait to get back to Konoha, so he could work with Anko, pain or no pain. At least she listened to what he had to say. He felt a chill race along his spine as he realized what he had just thought. Frowning, he shook all of that off. He needed to concentrate on the mission. He was so caught up in that strange paradox he almost crashed into the group as the team came to a sudden halt. It took some quick work, but Naruto managed to land without doing anything to give INO an excuse to ridicule him. Grumbling, the blonde crouched, wondering at the strange look on Hayate's face, then looked down at the camp and froze. Unlike the other camps, which had looked nothing more than abandoned, this one was in ruins. There were tattered tents, and debris scattered all over the place. Naruto started taking those stories about demons the old men had told him in Nigwaki seriously. He just couldn't see any animals or ninja totally ruining a camp like this. Harate sensor, what happened? INO asked after a moment, her tone uneasy. I'm not sure, Harate said, crouching down, studying the camp intently. This is very unusual. This is. Could it have been some sort of wild animal? INO suggested in confusion. Like, a pack of wild dogs. I don't think so, Harate said, coughing softly. Naruto, can you create a couple of cave bunshine to check on things? Naruto nodded. Putting his personal feelings aside, he did just that, sending in 3 cave bunshine before glancing at Harate in curiosity. Oi, so why do you want me to make the clones? In case that enemy ninja were behind this, Harate explained. They might have left a trap. This way a bunshine can set it off, and we can avoid losing anyone. Oh. Wait a minute, INO interjected. A bunshine is just an illusion, so like, how can it set off a trap? Well, these are cave bunshine. Harate explained, coughing, as he stood. This is an advanced technique used for various functions, primarily spying. That still doesn't explain how it works, INO responded, snorting. The technique creates physical bodies that are indistinguishable from the user, INO-san, and any information they gather is sent back instantly to the user once they disappear. Harate sighed before leaping into a nearby tree without another word. Naruto, however, remained where he was, surprised at the knowledge he had just learned about his signature technique. He wasn't so distracted though that he could miss Ino's snort or Shino's odd glance before both followed Harate into the other. Why hadn't Anko ever explained that? All she had ever been interested in was making sure he could use his chakra more effectively. Filing that information away for later, Naruto followed the rest of his team. Damn forest, Ino muttered, surreptitiously pulling at her purple top to stop it from sticking to her. First there had been rain, and then the sun had decided it was time to show up, and now she was sweating so badly that her clothes were sticking to her. The forest shade wasn't helping to cool things off either, and she just thanked the gods that she had decided on wearing a sleeveless top. Glancing at her three male teammates, Ino honestly couldn't understand how those three could wear such hot clothing. Didn't they understand that they were running a high chance of heat exhaustion? Maybe they just didn't feel the heat, but she found that impossible to believe, especially with the way that Naruto kept wiping at his face every few minutes. For a moment she felt like saying something, but decided that even if he was a perverted idiot, even he deserved to be left alone in this heat. Shaking her head, Ino turned her attention back to the tree limbs passing beneath her, working twice as hard to maintain her pace. They had only been on the move for 2 hours, ever since the discovery of that first ruined camp, but she could already feel her body starting to wear down. Ino masked her groan as a sigh, wishing she had more stamina and chakra, even though she had already accepted that she was possibly one of the weakest people out of their graduating class. Thinking of weak people caused her to glance once more at Naruto. A little over a week ago, she would have said he was the weakest one from their class. However, it had become obvious to her that he had stamina and chakra galore, at least one advanced jutsu, and no problem with tree walking or climbing. Ino grudgingly began to accept the possibility that Naruto could be as strong as Sasuke. Tiredly, she looked ahead once more, studying the grey of Shino's jacket and the green of the forest as they darted through the trees. The only sound was the rustling of leaves, the twang of a tree branch and the occasional muttered curse, which ultimately started to annoy Ino more than anything. It was too silent, which meant it was boring, and Ino was not a person that could stand boredom for long. Which meant, naturally, that Ino had to decide how to stop herself from getting bored. She could try to talk with Shino, but the boy really wasn't much on conversations. She could try to talk with Harate, but he tended just to cough, say a few words, and then let her carry the conversation. She could talk with Naruto, or more to the point, aggravate him and thus get into an argument, which would be fun, but pointless. Or she could play a game she had created shortly after meeting her new sensei. She had yet to name it, but it really was quite simple. All she did was take a person, usually male, and apply her fashion-conscious mind toward finding the proper look for them. Ino smiled to herself, deciding that the game would be the best choice, which meant she now needed a subject. Sadly, her subject choices were severely limited. Ino had already decided that Shino had a good look and that Harate would look best in black and green instead of all green. Which meant she really had only one other person to select for her game. Ino grimaced just thinking about Naruto minus, or, more correctly, his orange jacket minus, but she glanced at him anyway to memorize certain things she needed to get the proper picture. After several minutes of intense study, she looked away, a headache starting to throb behind her eyes, and set her mind to work. First she would select his primary color, something that would give her a basis to work from in his color scheme. Which meant she needed to select the easiest of the three primary colors to work with, red. More precisely, she began with orange and started darkening it through various shades of red. That, however, produced an even worse look for him than orange, which she had not even thought possible. Undaunted, she decided to replace red with blue and began working her way through the various shades. Aqua, azure, cerulean, indigo, navy, turquoise. None of those produced the right result either, which irked Ino slightly, but she soldiered on, switching the blues to yellow. She got as far as canary yellow before she felt her headache worsen, and she quickly switched to the secondary colors, starting with purple. Ino, however, made a very annoying discovery: purple wasn't working. He looked horrible in mauve, violet and any other shade. That should have been impossible. After all, he had blonde hair and blue eyes, he should have at least looked natural in that color. Instead, to her horror, he looked like a fat man in a pair of Speedos. Angry, she moved on to the other secondary colors, skipping brown completely in favor to green. She got as far as olive green before she realized that it wasn't his color at all. Frowning, she wondered what else to try and decided that maybe gray was the key. After several attempts at picturing him in gray colors, she decided that color wasn't to him either. Which left her with only two options, white and black. Realizing just how difficult this would be, INO paused her game to consider why the others had failed. Thankfully, she had plenty of time since Harate had told them they wouldn't reach the next campsite until later in the day. It didn't take her long, now that she was thinking about it, to figure out what the problem was. His hair was a brighter blonde than hers, bright yellow instead of pale yellow, and his blue eyes were brighter. Which meant almost any primary color on him would be a horrible choice. Unless it was a neutral color. INO carefully weighed both white and black, and then settled on black. Concentrating, she pictured him in jet black clothes and was startled at just how well that color worked. His blonde hair stood out boldly and his eyes seemed even brighter. It was the perfect primary color for him. Then, as she stared at this mental image, she found herself making a realization that quickly made her stop playing the game. Shaken, she felt eyes on her and glanced at the blonde in question and found him giving her a curious look. "Why the hell are you looking at me?" INO snapped. "'Cause you kept looking at me," Naruto retorted. "Only because I couldn't believe how disgusting you were," INO shot back. "At least I'm not so ugh," Naruto started to say, only to as Harate cut him off. Naruto-san, INO-san, please be quiet. We could be surrounded by enemies and I would like to hear their approach instead of your bickering," Harate said, followed by a soft cough. Naruto grumbled heatedly, shooting her another look before he turned his attention away from her. INO sighed, looking away as well, glad that neither one had seemed to notice the faint tint in her cheeks. "Kami-sama, help me," but he was cuter, INO muttered softly to herself, unable to believe that for 1 minute she had thought that Naruto was cuter than Sasuke. Landing adroitly, Naruto glanced at Shino, Harate and INO before starting off on his own, wandering through the debris of the camp. This was the 5th camp they had visited today, and just like the others, it was in ruins with no discernible reason. Even his cave bunshine, which had become standard procedure minus, could find no traps. Not that Naruto expected to find any, he was convinced this was the work of forest demons of some sort. Kneeling next to an overturned field kit, he studied it for a moment, then glanced over at the others watching as each one went about searching for a clue. He frowned watching INO, for several minutes, wondering why she was apparently going out of her way to avoid him. Not that he was going to complain about that, but this seemed like something different than what he was used to. Maybe there was something wrong with her. Naruto frowned a bit more. As much as he disliked her, he was the only one that seemed to notice anything wrong. Could he just be imagining things? Shaking his head, he stood preparing to confront her when he froze, feeling as if something was watching him. Turning, he scanned the area around him and then, for no discernible reason, he started walking toward a clump of trees. He felt like he was being drawn toward something, like there was something that was nagging at the edge of his mind. He paused, looking around, then continued on his way, moving uncertainly towards what he had no clue. Frowning deeply now, Naruto followed this odd feeling of familiarity. It was like there was a part of him trying to remember some half-forgotten memory, but he couldn't figure it out. Shaking it off, he came to a stop in front of the trees and knelt at what appeared to be a patch of normal ground. He started to leave, but then part of him insisted that he checked it more closely. Pulling a kunai, he studied the undisturbed ground, straining his eyes. Just as he was about to give up, he hesitated, wondering if he saw a groove there or not. Using a finger first, he traced the edge, discovering a strange thin film, which prompted him to use his kunai. Slipping the kunai into the groove, he applied pressure for several minutes until he was finally rewarded with a lid of sorts popping open. Using his left hand, he leveraged it up, staring into the odd tunnel. He was getting a bad feeling from this thing, but as far as he could tell, it was merely the entrance to an underground storage area. Should he tell Harate about this or go down by himself? Harate would say he should be told, but he could feel his instincts say that he should go alone first. "Naruto, we're leaving," INO suddenly shouted, and Naruto jerked, startled so much that the kunai slipped and the lid slammed shut. Turning, he focused on INO, who was waiting on him impatiently, while he could see Harate and Shino already on the move through the trees. "Oi! You don't have to shout," Naruto shouted back, climbing to his feet and glaring at her out of habit. He was actually surprised she had bothered to wait on him, and he didn't want to piss her off too much. "Look who's talking," INO snapped at him, crossing her arms. "Come on, Harate-sensei wants to check out one more camp for the night." Naruto grumbled, but stood, wondering why she was suddenly being so nice to him. Well, nice for her at least, it was still downright hostile by other people's standards. Still, Naruto decided as he moved toward her, no point in wasting her sudden bout of kindness. He was halfway to her when he felt something and paused, turning to stare at the area behind but found nothing but empty air. What the hell? Naruto muttered, scratching the back of his head in confusion. Like, are you coming or not? INO demanded curtly, which snapped him out of his confusion. Grumbling, Naruto hurriedly reached her side, then gave one last glance behind him to double-check. Come on, hurry up, idiot, INO said as she jumped into the tree behind them and took off. Naruto followed suit and was soon pacing beside her, while Harate and Shino maintained their lead. Oi, are you always this slow? Naruto asked after a moment. Oh, is this too slow for you? INO shot back unexpectedly. Okay, Barker, try to keep up then. That said, she increased her speed, darting several trees ahead. Naruto blinked, wondering where the hell she had gotten that burst of speed from. Then he grinned, deciding to prove just how awesome he really was. It took only a little concentration, and then he was darting after her, covering the distance she had gained in a matter of seconds. Pacing her for a moment, he took a sort of entertainment from her surprise, then he stuck his tongue out, returning her earlier jab tit for tat. Okay, piggy, now you try to keep up. That said, he pulled ahead of her easily, listening to her curse as she struggled to catch up to him. Ha! That should show her. Grinning, Naruto filed away this victory for future remembrance and instead concentrated on other matters, such as Sakura and his future as Hokage. Feeling doubly pleased, he added some acrobatics to his leaps, only stopping when Harate told him to stop clowning around. Grumbling at the unfairness of it, Naruto glanced behind him to see INO trailing after them. The look on her face promised nothing but violence. Feeling guilty, he dropped back, remaining out of her reach, but close enough that she wasn't traveling alone. Her glare almost made him wish he had stayed up there with Harate and Shino. Still, if she got exhausted, then she could get killed, and for the moment she was his teammate. Hey, you okay? Yeah, I'm fine, INO muttered, glaring at him. Are you here to, like, torture me some more? INO suddenly demanded, startling Naruto. Naruto blinked, staring at her, then realized that maybe his showing off just now in his little race with her wasn't the right thing to do. Still, the way she was glaring at him. Well, it was her fault. She had started it. Then he remembered what Urka had told him once. It doesn't matter who started it. What matters is how you handle it. Damn it. Naruto cursed, wishing he could has not remembered that. Hey, sorry to ruin it to you, INO grumbled, her breathing getting labored. Oi, you're the one that started the damn race, Naruto said defensively. Race? INO deadpan, staring at him. I wasn't racing, and even if I did, you were the one that started it. Are you always this slow? Remember? Naruto coughed. Oh yeah, he had said that. Suddenly he realized that INO was slowing even more, and he followed suit, which earned him a strange look from INO. What? I'm just, like, trying to figure out what the hell you're doing. I'm making sure you're okay, Naruto said, wondering what her problem was. Yeah, sure. Oi, look, maybe we don't like each other alright, but we are on the same team, Naruto said, rolling his eyes. Bees, what is it with you? I didn't know you cared, INO said sarcastically. Naruto sighed and just stayed quiet. It was his fault, after all, and besides, like he had told her, they were teammates. Still, he couldn't wait for this damn mission to be over, so he could get the hell away from them. To say that INO was put off was an understatement. After all, Naruto's apparent concern for her had held steady for the last 2 hours. Even after she had told him she was fine, even after she tried to pull ahead, Naruto wouldn't let her get away from him. He stayed out of her reach, a wise move she thought, but he kept pace with her no matter what. It thoroughly confused her, and she kept reminding herself that he was really just a perverted idiot. On the other hand, she took some comfort in the fact that Naruto was more interesting to travel with than Shino was. After all, Naruto was always willing to bicker and argue with her. INO was so lost in her own little world that she just barely brought herself to a stop before she slammed into Shino. She teetered for a moment, and then caught her balance. Grumbling, she glared between Shino and Hayate's shoulders to stare at the final campsite for the day. It, like the others, was in ruins, but it seemed fresher to her, more recent. Still, it reaffirmed her thought that a camp full of loggers should has at least managed to kill something. Looks the same as the last few, Harate said softly, studying the camp intently. Naruto-san. Seconds later there were 3 soft pops and 3 orange blurs were hurtling into the camp. INO shifted her weight slightly, wondering why they even bothered with those damn things. It wasn't like they had ever found a hint of a trap. All clear, Naruto finally said, his tone bored. Alright. Same as before. Shino with me. INO, you're with Naruto, Harate said, and then as all 3 genin nodded he led the way into the camp. Shino landed and, regaining his balance, started searching the immediate area, while Harate went to the left, leaving Naruto and INO to take the far side of the camp. Letting Naruto move away from her slightly, INO went through the motions, wanting to find something, but lacking the energy for an actual search. She mused idly with accepting Naruto's theory, but then decided that was insane. INO was not about to buy Naruto's insane theory about demons eating people's souls. The blonde was so damn gullible it wasn't even funny. Imagine believing a bunch of old men's stories about demons in the forest. Shaking her head, she started searching in earnest. Sifting through the ruined tents and overturned carts, she felt the annoying beginnings of hunger pains. Oh great, just what she needed. Standing upright, INO opened her mouth to say something to Harate, only to stop short when she heard the sound of something rushing through the forest. Turning, she strained her eyes, trying to figure out what was charging around in her hand, even going so far as trailing to a kunai for protection. Unable to make anything out, she marked it off, as her imagination turned just as something suddenly slammed into her from the side and knocked her to the ground. "Yeah!" A deep voice shouted from over her. INO was reeling from the impact and couldn't quite gather what was happening. Then, suddenly the weight was taken away and she sat up, cheeks red from anger and embarrassment, surprised to find Harate and Shino subduing the person that had slammed into her. The guy was babbling insanely, his teeth were yellowed and his skin held a sickly pallor. INO couldn't help but grimace, realizing that had been what tackled her. Climbing to her feet, she dusted herself off, glaring at the man. "Get away. You gotta get away. Take me with you." INO shook her head, glancing at Shino, who had raised an eyebrow in curiosity. Suddenly the man's fear morphed almost immediately into hope as he grasped Hayate's hands while looking around at them excitedly. "Thank the kami for you. For all of you. This is great. I hid, but they kept hunting and I knew they knew where I was. Oh, they thought I didn't, but they did. Listen. Can you tell us anything about who's been attacking the loggers?" Harate asked calmly, a hand on the man's shoulder. INO watched the sheer terror that filled the man's face, followed by spittle forming at the corners of his mouth. A paroxysm of insane laughter shook him and he shook his head. No. "Can you lead us back to where you were attacked?" Harate started to ask, only to stop as he realized the man wasn't moving. INO backed away slightly, surprised at the sudden silence. What the hell had happened? Harate stood, his face serious. "Dead." Coughing, he turned, staring at his team. "We're going back the way he came, maybe we'll find out what's going on." "Oi, but what about this? I think I found a clue," Naruto suddenly said, waving a large something in front of him. "What is that?" Harate asked, blinking as he grabbed the boy's hand to hold it still. "I think it's a spider's leg," Naruto said excitedly. "It looks more like a piece of konoha bamboo," INO responded, studying the long spiny object in the blonde's hand. "It is not," Naruto shouted defensively, pulling the item away from Harate. "Like, you're not going to say that these demons of yours are giant spiders, are you?" INO rolled her eyes. "Why not?" Naruto retorted excitedly. "Look, if they're demonic spiders then minus. Oh, give it a rest. Those old men were just telling, like tall tales. There are no demons eating people's souls," INO retorted, cutting the blonde off. "But minus. Naruto, listen to what you're saying," INO demanded, narrowing her eyes. "Giant demonic spiders are killing people and eating their souls. Those that sound even remotely sane. Oi, are you stupid?" Naruto suddenly barked back, waving the object at her. The Kyubi was a giant demon fox. What makes giant demonic spiders any less possible? Because there's no such thing as a giant spider, INO shouted back. Actually, I have seen large spiders before within the Forest of Death," Harate suddenly interjected. "It could be a group of nins that are using giant spiders. Like how my family uses bugs," Shino suggested calmly. INO fumed, glaring at the other two, It was taking all of her will not to shout at them for obviously siding with another guy. She managed it however, giving a disdainful sniff. Well, it's still not a demon. It is highly doubtful that a demon would take the shape of a spider. However, at least now we know what we are dealing with, Harate said before coughing. We need to hurry, the sun will be setting soon. INO grinned victoriously at a crestfallen-looking Naruto who grumbled as they jumped into the trees to follow the man's path. We've lost the trail. Harate muttered, crouching down. Stay close, the map Jovi-san gave us shows we're close to the edge of the ravine. Naruto nodded, resisting the urge to mutter in annoyance. It had been hours ago, when they had their first big lead, that logger had left an obvious trail, but now there was nothing. Glancing around at the small natural clearing, the blonde felt something creeping up the back of his neck. It was like when he found that storage tunnel, or even that spider's legs. He didn't care what INO said, a part of him was shouting that there was something unnatural in the area. Shaking it off, he glanced at INO, who was carefully inspecting a set of trees. Then Naruto glanced at Shino, who was frozen for some strange reason. That's weird. Naruto muttered, moving toward the boy. If Shino had frozen up, that could spell disaster for the team, much as Naruto's own experience with freezing had taught him. Reaching the other ninja's side, Naruto paused, looking around before talking. Oi, are you okay? Shino didn't speak. He didn't move. His attention seemed to be fixed on the forest floor for some reason, and Naruto followed his gaze, noting odd indentations. That weird feeling washed over him, and Naruto was just preparing to kneel and check out the indentations when INO suddenly shrieked, distracting him. Snapping his head around, he saw her jumping backwards as 5 large spiders dropped to the ground from overhead. Oh hell, Naruto started to say, only to jump backwards as well, carrying Shino with him as the ground in front of him suddenly exploded upwards and another large spider came into the open. Landing, Naruto's eyes darted everywhere, his mind almost frantic at the sight of such massive creature surrounding them. They're all around us. Thanks for the warning, Mr. Obvious. INO shrieked, a note of hysteria in her voice. Then, as one, the spiders attacked. Aim for their weak points, Harate said, his sword hissing as it left the sheath to meet the spider's head on. Right. Naruto shouted, ducking under one of the spiders as it lunged. On instinct, the blonde produced a kunai, plunging it into the creature's stomach and heaved. Casting the monster aside, he glanced left to see Harate slashing through the monsters with ease. Nothing's working. INO shouted, and Naruto looked at her. She was struggling desperately, mostly just fending off the seeking fangs of the spider that was stalking her. Try their bellies. Naruto shouted, and then, realizing she wasn't paying attention to him, he grabbed a kunai and an explosive note. Looking up, he timed it just as the spider in question was leaping at her, and fired off his explosive kunai. Seconds later, the spider exploded in a shower of gore, and Naruto started to work on more of his explosive kunai, ignoring INO to the moment. Naruto was so intent on this task that he was caught utterly flat-footed as a spider leapt at him. Then it was his turn to be showered in gore. Blinking in surprise, he looked around to find INO glaring at him as she prepared even more kunai. Naruto, however, grinned before remembering Shino. Spinning, the blonde felt his breath hitch. There was the boy, in the same place as before, only now there was a spider slowly stalking towards him. Naruto moved as if to launch an exploding kunai, only to have the spider sliced in half by Harate. Then, seconds later, the man was pushing off the now dead spider to gain height and twirling his blade, in an odd fashion before the few remaining spiders were sliced into gory chunks. Landing, Harate crouched, glancing at Shino before speaking. Is everyone okay? Like, I could seriously use a shower, INO answered disgustedly, shooting Naruto a dark glare. But yeah, I'm fine. Naruto, however, was looking around, grinning slightly. He couldn't wait to tell Anko about this. Then he heard INO's scream and he blinked, watching as the single largest spider he had ever seen came lumbering out of the forest. If the first spiders had been the size of dogs, then the one that was charging at Harate was the size of a horse. Harate dove left then right, knocking Shino aside as he avoided the spider. Naruto, however, was already charging forward, exploding kunai in hand. Just as Naruto threw his first volley, Harate darted out of range quicker than the eye could follow. Yes. Naruto shouted happily, preparing to celebrate, since obviously nothing could have withstood that blast. His celebration was cut short, however, when the billowing smoke of the exploding kunai was parted, allowing a thick liquid to slam into his chest. He had time to one shouted curse, and then he was pinned against the tree. Dazed, Naruto hung there until he felt something hairy brushing against his cheeks. Recovering, he looked up and discovered himself staring into the multiple red eyes and very large fangs of the spider. Naruto wasn't sure how he managed it, but he freed an arm and lashed out as best he could, warding off those sword-sized fangs. Dance of the minus Harate started to shout, only two, has the spider spin and cut him off with a blast of webbing. Naruto, frantic, began to slice himself free from the webbing, only to jerk his head up as Ino's scream rent the air. Somehow, the blonde girl had managed to grab the Jonin's sword and was charging forward, making a chopping motion at the spider. Naruto's eyes widened, wondering what the hell was going through her mind, and then cursed his stupidity and went back to work on freeing himself. Then he heard Ino's second scream, and Naruto looked once more to see Ino sprawled on her ass, the sword nowhere to be seen and the spider hissing as it towered over her. Ino, her breath hitching, crawled backwards as fast as she could, leaving the sword she had grabbed behind. What had she been thinking? She had been terrified watching as the spider had charged in, taking the only fighters on their team apart, and it was only when Harate was taken down that her instincts had taken over. She couldn't even remember how she had reached its sword or charging at the monster. All she could remember was slashing at the thing and then being knocked on her ass. Suddenly, she came to a jarring stop as she ran into a tree. It was in that moment that Ino realized that she was dead. She felt almost detached. Funny, she would have thought she'd panic more. Amazingly, it was at that moment that her mind started sending her memories. Her life was flashing before her eyes. There she was at 3, bossing Shikamaru around. The spider was getting closer. There she was helping the helpless Sakura. The monster was almost on top of her. What is you dream? Harate asked blandly. Ino blushed. 2 gets Sasuke minus. It was the orange that caught her attention. Even at twilight she couldn't mistake that orange. It hurtled through the air and slammed into the spider towering over her, and amazingly, the impact was enough to knock the monster off balance, and it toppled sideways through several trees. Landing heavily, Naruto collapsed to one knee, panting. Naruto. Ino choked out, but was surprised when the blonde ignored her and instead raised his fingers to create a small army of clones. Ino didn't see the point, but the army charged as the beast fought its way upright. We've got to get out of here, Ino said anxiously, getting back to her feet. I has an idea. Naruto said, panting heavily. Naruto. We're only genins. This thing is way too strong for us. Ino protested, staring at him incredulously. Harate-sensei is hurt, Shino isn't fighting, and I'm not exactly that good at combat. I'm going to be Hokage, I'm not going to run away. Naruto said forcefully, turning to fix her with an intense gaze. Ino opened her mouth to shout him down, but froze. That gaze was beyond anything she had ever seen. It was intent, it was strong, and Ino wasn't sure why, but at that moment she felt as if she was seeing some hero from a story her father used to read to her. Naruto smirked as if realizing that she had given in, and Ino felt her own uncertainty being erased. Let's get wild. Naruto suddenly shouted as the last of his clone army disappeared in a puff of smoke, allowing the monster freedom of movement. Ino jumped back, watching as Naruto began hurling exploding kunai at the ground in front of the spider, herding it away from Harate and Shino. Ino watched for a moment, then realizing what he was doing sought her own hastily made exploding kunai to help him. The spider hissed, charging forward, only to retreat as the ground in front of it exploded. It was slow, and it was tedious, but Ino didn't stop. She just prayed this didn't backfire on them, but the longer they went and the closer they came to the edge of the plateau, the less she doubted that would happen. The spider staggered and weaved drunkenly, severely disoriented. It lashed out with its legs, trying desperately to stop the assault. Seconds later, they stumbled from the forest 100 feet from the perilously dangerous edge of the plateau. Soon, they were 75 feet, 50 feet, 30-25. Throwing her last exploding kunai, Ino paused, panting heavily. It had taken everything she had to keep up with Naruto. She just prayed it had been enough. She thirked, however, when a chorus of yas filled the air, and Ino found herself staring at who knew how many damn clones of Naruto who were attacking head-on. It wouldn't be enough though. Ino could feel somewhere inside her. The spiders would recover soon, kill them both, that would be it. Ino watched in horror as the clones began to explode repeatedly until only Naruto was left. This was it. First Naruto would die, and then her. Naruto, however, seemed oblivious to that fact and charged in, a shout on his lips. Ino watched as the spider lashed out to smash him alongside the head, but Naruto suddenly disappeared through a full second, only to reappear and drive a kunai into the underside of the monster. The spider reared back from the blow, hissing as it went tumbling over the edge. Ino blinked in surprise, her fear blossoming into hope. Jade get to live. You did it. Ino cheered, thrusting her hands in the air happily. Ino was so excited that she even started forward to hug the boy, but she stopped as a section of ground exploded upwards and time seemed to slow down. Ino knew what was coming before she saw it happen. 1 minute Naruto had been standing there grinning, and the next a spider was grabbing him by the legs and yanking him underground. Ino suddenly collapsed, staring at the space in abject horror. Time continued to crawl for several more minutes, and then it sped back up and Ino felt her stomach drop out of her as an enormous silence settled over the area. This was the first time she had ever seen a friend die in front of her, and she absently wondered why her cheeks felt wet. Consciousness returned to Harate in a painful stab between his eyes, making it feel as if he'd been stabbed with a chakra-laced weapon. An acrid taste was in his mouth, and his entire body was hurting. For a moment, he lost consciousness again, then he forced his eyes open. A blinding pain shot through his head, setting off a screaming of muscles through his body until he forced the pain away. Taking a breath, he rested for a moment, though his head ached abominably. Finally his eyes adjusted to the darkness and he realized that he had been unable to see anything during those first moments after opening his eyes. Thankfully, however, his blurred vision was sharpening to the point that he could distinguish Shino's fire-lit face. "Harate sensei," Shino said, his voice seeming to come great echoing distance. Harate opened his mouth, managing a croaking sound, then cleared his throat and nodded, prompting the blinding pain to return. He dominated it and sat up, knowing that it would take a few minutes for his body to block the pain yet again. Still, he needed to check on his team now, while he had the chance. Eyes sweeping the camp, he noticed Ino sitting further away from him, her eyes locked on the fire, and then noted Naruto's absence. "What happened?" Harate asked in a croaking voice, staring at Shino quietly. "I'm not sure. My Kaikeichu are connected to me in a certain manner and they overwhelmed my mind," Shino explained stoically. "When I had recovered, I found you unconscious and Ino crying near the edge of the plateau." "What about Naruto?" Harate managed, gazing at Ino with an uneasy feeling of why exactly she was crying. "I could find him nowhere," Shino said before glancing at the girl. "However, she did tell me what happened. He fought, using exploding notes to herd the spider to the edge where he sent it over. She was unclear what happened after that, but I did gather that he was dead." "I see," Harate said, covering his mouth as he coughed, which caused his head to explode in pain once more. After the pain lessened enough, he began to think, wondering what to do now. Things would be a bit difficult for his team, especially when it seemed he was poisoned. There was no point denying it, without Naruto, they were nearly defenseless. However, they couldn't just abandon the mission. We has no choice then. Tomorrow you two will has to locate and mark the enemy on the map minus. Are you crazy? Ino shouted, turning toward him unexpectedly. Naruto's dead and you're poisoned. We need to get the hell out of here. Ino-san, remember the spiders and the ninja controlling them. I doubt they'll just let us go now, Hayate said before coughing once more. We need information, and you two are best suited to gathering it. I want you to gather information. I believe that these ninja are located near or in the ruins, but I need you to confirm that. Once you have, then you are to report back to Nigariki, where I will has our backup waiting. Ino stared at him in disbelief, but Harate pointedly ignored her, instead focusing on Shino. By the way, where is my sword? Shino turned slightly and then handed over the weapon, the sheath glowing slightly in the flickering firelight. Harate nodded his thanks, studying the weapon for a moment before he looked up at a sullen-looking Ino. Ino-san, I want you to take my sword with you and use it. What? Ino shouted, staring at him with wide eyes. You can't be serious. Harate, however, cut her off sharply. You are a shinobi of Konoha, you do not have the luxury of running away. Harate paused and locked his gaze with hers. This is not a pointless D-ranked mission, this mission is vital to Konoha's and the Fire Country's security. You must gather this information. If you abandon this mission and reject this responsibility, then you condemn hundreds of civilians to death and waste, one of our comrades and fellow shinobi's sacrifice. That said, Harate thrust his katana out sharply, his arm and shoulder flaring in pain, but he kept his face tightly controlled. Now do you duty. But I don't know how to use a sword, Ino said, taking the sword nervously. Harate coughed before giving her a reassuring smile. I has faith in you, so I know you will complete this mission and in some way perhaps you can avenge your fallen teammate. Well, that really doesn't help me use this sword, Ino snapped slightly. Harate was reassured at her sudden flare-up, and, after a moment of consideration, he decided on his course of action. Turning his attention away from Ino, he focused on Shino, who had seemed unbothered by the lack of attention. I'll transfer command to this portion of the mission to you. In the morning I'll head back to the village. And you two, head toward the ruins. When Shino nodded, Harate handed over the map, coughing again. Make sure to rotate watches tonight. Yes. But what of Ino-san? She has a point about not being able to use the sword properly. Harate nodded, then looked back at her seriously. I'll train her as best I can. Well, my cave bunshine will at least. I'm not sure how long he'll last, but he should be able to help a little. Seeing Ino's tiny nod of understanding, Harate closed his eyes and molded his sluggish chakra to create a cave bunshine. He tried to open his eyes to check, but his body was too strained and his mind slipped away into cold unconsciousness. Still, Harate did not sleep well. Ino wasn't sure what time it was. The sky was still dark, and for all she knew, it could be the middle of the night. Still, she moved, thankful that they had enough soldier pills to keep her going. In all honesty, she wanted to be sleeping still, and if Harate hadn't agreed to Shino's suggestion of starting now, she would have done just that. Sighing, the blonde pushed thoughts of sleep to the back of her mind, instead focusing on her remaining teammate, while trying to adjust to the katana now strapped to her back. It felt awkward, almost to has that sword on her body. She preferred holding it. When it was in her hands, the sword felt like a natural extension of her body. True, she wouldn't be able to use it nearly as well as Harate, but it still felt natural to her, and it offered some comfort. Reaching over her shoulder to touch the hilt, both for reassurance and to make sure she could reach it, Ino promised that, if she survived, she would get Harate to train her in Kenbutsu. Confidence bolstered, Ino removed her hand and seeing Shino come to a stop, followed his lead, crouching beside him on the tree branch. Squinting, Ino almost swore that she could see one of his bugs escape the boy's sleeve, but it was so dark she couldn't honestly say if she had or not. We'll have to wait a moment, until Yuthi-kun returns, Shino said softly, his dark silhouette not looking away from the sky. Ino nodded, then settled back to wait patiently. This of course didn't happen, and she found herself asking the one question that had been plaguing her since the attack. So, why'd you freeze? I mean, like, even I fought back. Shino was silent for several long minutes and Ino began to worry she had insulted him, but she mentally argued that it was a legitimate question. I am tied almost psychically to my family, Shino finally explained, forcing an odd tremble out of his voice. I believe their fear is so great that it is actually forcing me into a near-panicked state. That is not good, Ino admitted, eyes wide. I agree. Shino looked at her, holding an arm out toward the forest. However, now that I know about their reaction to the spiders, I can control my own reaction to an extent. Oh, Ino said, her voice soft. Well, at least she didn't have to worry too much about him freezing up so completely again. Yuthi-kun says that we should head west. He found a strange man, possibly a ninja, approaching from the east, Shino suddenly explained, his shadowy outline turning in that direction. If I remember the map Harate gave us correctly, the entrance to a cave is nearby. We should seek cover there until he's passed. Ino felt her breath hitch, staring at the boy in fear. She did not want to fight anyone, even with the sword. She didn't want to even dream of fighting a ninja. Are you sure we can make it? Ino asked cautiously, feeling a knot of unease in her stomach. If we are attacked, we won't have much of a chance. I agree, Shino said, taking off with Ino at his side. However, I believe we can make it to the cave unnoticed. Which means we will then stand a very good chance of escaping. Ino frowned, but remained silent, knowing what he had said was the truth but fearing it all the same. Resisting the urge to touch the katana on her back, she instead checked her pouch to reassure herself that she had a few things to fall back on. Satisfied, she checked her other pouch, counting the soldier pills without looking. They didn't, as very many Hawate refused to let them grow reliant on them or develop an immunity to their effects. Somewhat settled, INO turned her mind toward other matters, namely the fight from yesterday. Out of everything that had happened during that fight, she wondered about Naruto's willingness to fling himself into the fight. While her hands had been shaking the entire time, Naruto had seemed like a man possessed. She had seen him fight before, from back in the academy, but this had been different, more fluid. The change was almost mind-blowing, and INO shook her head. Obviously, this Anko Harate had mentioned was a better sensei that she ever could have imagined. "Are you okay, INO-san?" Shino suddenly asked, his dark silhouette pulling ahead slightly. "Ho. Oh yeah," INO said, blinking as she left her thoughts about the fight. "Hey Shino, what do you think this Anko is like?" Shino was silent for several long minutes, as if pondering that question before he finally answered. "My father has mentioned her once." He fell silent, then continued, obviously struggling for the best words. "She is not a pleasant woman." Oh. INO managed her mind trying to supply a mental image of such a woman. It proved futile, however, as she snorted and allowed her mind to lapse into blankness. After what felt like several hours, she finally noticed that she could make out a few minor details of Shino and the forest around her. Glancing at the sky, she felt mildly relieved at the black sky brightening to an indigo shade. She was so enraptured with this change in scenery that she missed Shino throwing his arm out until she ran into it. She started to shout at him. His hand had came in contact with a certain part of her body, but then saw that they were suddenly facing a very large spider web. "I thought you said the caves were this way," INO hissed, glaring at him. "They are," Shino said calmly, or at least he tried to sound calm. INO thought she could detect the slightest tremor in his voice. "We need to go around, and then continue on." That said, Shino took off at a new angle with INO hot on his heels. INO, however, felt a ripple of fear race along her spine, the knowledge that Shino could at any moment freeze completely, offering her no comfort. Forcefully, she stopped thinking about that and instead concentrated on keeping pace with the boy, wondering what they would do even if they did get the information needed and were caught, as they attempted to escape. The obvious answer filled her with dread, however. Since she was the least skilled at combat, she would have to escape and leave Shino behind. In essence, she would have to run away, desert her friend to save her life and the information. Until that moment, INO had never seriously entertained such thoughts, even though Harate had told them they would face such a decision someday. Maybe she was overreacting, maybe he wouldn't freeze up, and they could both make it back to Konoha safely. "If we are forced into combat, then one of us will have to escape while the other provides cover," Shino suddenly said. "If this happens, then you should attempt to escape. I would stand a better chance in a fight than you would." "You want me to run away?" INO asked, staring at him in surprise, wondering if he was able to read her mind. "It is often best to plan for all possible outcomes," Shino explained blandly. "We has 3 likely outcomes. First, we reach the caves, avoid the pursuing ninja, manage to gather the needed information, and escape successfully. Second, we fail to reach the caves and are thus killed. Third, and most likely, we reach the cave thus avoiding our pursuer, then manage to gather the needed information before one of us is caught, and the other escapes." INO opened her mouth to respond when she felt something thin brush against her shin before snapping. Coming to a halt, she turned in surprise, staring at where her leg had just passed through, wondering what she had just snapped in half. "What is it?" Shino asked, suddenly joining her on the branch she was on. "Like, I thought I felt something," INO said, shrugging as she glanced at the boy. Shino's attention, however, was focused on something behind her, something which prompted him to grab her hand and yank as he took off. "Run. Hey!" INO shouted, then glanced behind her to see what had terrified the boy. What she saw made her feel like they weren't moving fast enough. Springing from branch to branch were a dozen large grey spiders chasing them, their bodies growing clearer in the gloom as they closed the distance. INO focused her attention forward once more and started pouring on the speed, almost dragging Shino behind her. "What are we going to do?" INO panted, her lungs burning already. Damn it. From now on she was going to train more than fuss with her hair. Of course, that was if she lived long enough to train. Glancing at her partner, INO shuddered, not even wanting to know what it would be like be running through a forest with a swarm of sheer panic clawing at your mind. The boy, however, continued to move and function as if unbothered by his bug's feelings. We run faster and head directly for a cave entrance, Shino finally responded as they both redoubled their efforts to escape the gaining spiders. Minutes later, dodging blasts of webbing, they exploded from the forest into a massive, circular plain where a series of rocks thutted out of the earth like teeth. How much further? Ino panted heavily, forcing herself to continue running alongside Shino. It is just ahead, the dark-haired boy answered, turning to look behind him as a series of explosions filled the forest. I wonder if that will stop them all. His question was answered as several spiders came hurtling out of the forest, some smoking, but most looking untouched. Ino, who had taken the moment to catch her breath, darted forward, heading to the cave mouth. For one blind moment she realized that she had left Shino behind and even started to go back when he caught up with her easily. Focusing once more on the shelter ahead, she began to wonder if they would ever reach it. No matter how much they ran, it didn't seem to be getting any closer. Panic started to build as her ribs began to throb from the exertion. She was past the point of ignoring the pain. It was now a white-hot pain in her side. Ino was too tired, even to curse about how pathetic she was. All that mattered was that she stopped long enough to recover. Shaking her head, Ino dug deep, but her body was so tired she just wanted to sleep. Did it really matter if they were killed by giant spiders? All that did matter was resting, stopping the burning in her lungs, her legs from aching and her ribs from throbbing. Then, suddenly, she tripped, stumbled and fell, skidding into the loose gravel of the cave mouth. Seconds later, the rough surface of loose rocks dug into her hands as Shino followed her. She wasn't allowed to rest long, as he grabbed her arm and helped her up, hurrying deeper into the cave while turning to throw a kunai at the entrance. Seconds later, there was a loud explosion and the sound of great chunks of rock thundering to the floor. It took her a few minutes of breathing the stale air before she realized that they had made it to the cave, and that Shino had sealed him inside. It took several more minutes for her lungs to stop burning, and she finally noticed that any trace of daylight was now hidden from view completely. Ino had a bad feeling about this. That's it to this part. If you enjoyed it, then like, share and subscribe to the next video, as it's going to be more interesting, and also check out my other playlist. Hope you would like them too.